My name is Charmaine. I am 35 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful software developer, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale brunch to catch up. Between mimosas and avocado toast, my mother leaned forward and smirked. You know, Charmaine, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way. I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night, I logged in, disabled every family credit account, and emailed my lawyer about selling the cabin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our four-bedroom house with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom, painted pale blue at my mother Elaine's insistence despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary and my prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight A's, joined honor societies, and did everything perfectly. But it was never enough to earn her genuine warmth. That emotional distance prepared me for the harsh reality of my marriage. To understand how I ended up sitting at that brunch holding all the power you have to understand what happened 3 months ago in Atlanta. That was the day my life completely shattered. The rain was pouring down on the concrete of the downtown Atlanta courthouse. The divorce was officially finalized just 10 minutes prior. I walked out of the heavy glass doors feeling completely numb, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm in my chest. I had no money to fight back. Donovan, my now ex-husband, had hired the most vicious and expensive legal team in the state. During the proceedings, he successfully argued that every single asset we shared was technically tied to his real estate development firm. It was a shell company he had secretly built using my life savings and my software algorithms. Because of an ironclad, manipulated prenuptial agreement that he pressured me into signing under the guise of protecting our future children, I was left with absolutely nothing. I stood under the courthouse awning, clutching my cheap purse. The cold wind whipped my hair across my face. Donovan walked out right behind me. He did not look at me with pity or remorse. He looked at me with sheer annoyance. He stepped close, his expensive cologne turning my stomach, and he reached out. He snatched the keys to the Range Rover right out of my hand. The metal dug sharply into my palm, but I was too stunned to speak or fight back. He loudly reminded me, loud enough for the passing lawyers and security guards to hear, that the judge awarded him the car. He claimed he purchased it with his project bonuses, conveniently leaving out the fact that I had paid the mortgage on our house for 3 years, so he could save that money. He told me to get my belongings out of the trunk immediately. He smirked and added that his new fiancée Brielle did not like the smell of my cheap perfume lingering on the leather seats. Brielle was 27, the daughter of a wealthy investor, and exactly the kind of trophy Donovan had always wanted. I walked over to the vehicle with my hands shaking uncontrollably. I popped the trunk and pulled out my 2 scuffed suitcases. They were heavy, packed hastily with the few clothes and personal items the lawyers allowed me to keep. It was a pathetic summary of an 8-year marriage. The cold rain instantly soaked through my thin coat and chilled me to the bone. But the dropping temperature was nothing compared to the ice in the voice of the woman standing next to Donovan. It was Vanessa, Donovan's older sister. She stood there holding a massive designer umbrella, carefully shielding her expensive silk blouse from the drizzle. She looked down at my worn-out suitcases sitting on the wet pavement and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. I told you a girl who used to braid hair in the projects could never fit into our family. She sneered, her voice echoing in the empty gray parking lot. Take your trash and go. Her words stung deeply and dragged up years of relentless condescension. When Donovan and I first met, I was working 2 grueling jobs. I was coding at night and braiding hair during the day just to pay for my degree. His family, deeply entrenched in Atlanta high society, never let me forget where I came from. They viewed my humble beginnings not as a testament to my work ethic, but as a permanent stain on their perfect pedigree. Vanessa had made it her life mission to remind me that I was an outsider. She treated me like a charity case that her brother had generously taken in to polish. She criticized my clothes, my natural hair, and the way I spoke. And now she was relishing in my ultimate downfall. She watched with a triumphant smirk as I stood there in the rain, stripped of my dignity, my home, and my marriage. Donovan pressed the button on the key fob. The Range Rover chirped happily, a stark contrast to my misery. He climbed into the driver's seat without a second glance back at the woman who had supported him when he had nothing. Vanessa got into the passenger side and rolled up the tinted window to shut me out completely. The heavy engine roared to life, and the luxury SUV sped off, intentionally splashing dirty puddle water onto my only pair of clean jeans. I stood there entirely alone. The courthouse plaza emptied out as people rushed to escape the storm. I pulled out my phone, my fingers trembling so badly I could barely unlock the screen. I opened my banking app and prayed for a miracle. My checking account balance stared back at me in cruel, bold numbers: $42.15. That was my entire net worth. I had no car, no apartment, and my own parents back in Connecticut had told me they did not have the space to take me in. When I called them, crying the night Donovan kicked me out, my mother Elaine simply sighed and said they did not want to get involved in messy divorce drama. They had essentially abandoned me, choosing to maintain their pristine social standing rather than offer a safe harbor for their own daughter. With water dripping down my face and soaking my clothes, I grabbed the handles of my suitcases. I dragged them across the rough pavement, the wheels clicking loudly, and walked toward the bus stop at the corner of the street. I paid the fare with crumpled dollar bills and sat in the very back of the city bus. I shivered uncontrollably as the air conditioning blasted over my damp clothes. I watched the city lights of Atlanta blur past the rain-streaked window. My mind raced with panic and despair. I did not know where I was going to sleep tonight or how I was going to eat tomorrow. I had only one place left to go. It was the only piece of property not tied up in the divorce proceedings, mostly because Donovan and his lawyers thought it was utterly worthless and not worth the paperwork to seize. It was my late grandfather Elijah's abandoned, dilapidated cabin in the woods, situated 2 hours away from the city limits. Grandpa Elijah had passed away a few years ago and left the small plot of land to me in a simple handwritten will. I had not been there since I was a teenager. I did not even know if it still had electricity, running water, or a roof that could keep out the rain. But it was the only address left to my name. It was the only place in the world where I could lock the door and hide from the humiliation that had become my life. As the bus rattled down the dark, wet highway, I closed my eyes and let the first real tears fall. I felt utterly defeated and broken by a man I had loved and a family that had always despised me. But as I rode through the storm, I was completely unaware that the broken-down cabin I was heading toward was not just a shack in the woods. It was hiding a secret left behind by a brilliant man who knew exactly what kind of snakes I was dealing with. Grandpa Elijah always told me that the loudest people in the room were usually the weakest, and that true power moved in absolute silence. I just never understood what he meant until everything else was stripped away. Donovan thought he had buried me under a mountain of legal debt and emotional trauma. He thought leaving me with $42 and 2 suitcases would force me to crawl back to my parents and beg for mercy. Vanessa thought she had successfully purged the working-class girl from her elite bloodline. They were all completely wrong. The pain radiating through my chest on that bus ride was suffocating, but beneath the sorrow, a tiny spark of survival was beginning to ignite. The road ahead was pitch black, and the rain showed no signs of stopping. But the destination at the end of this miserable journey would mark the beginning of my rebirth and the absolute end of their entire empire. The bus dropped me off 2 miles from the dirt road turnoff. I dragged my suitcases through the thick, slippery mud, the small plastic wheels catching on every jagged rock and exposed tree root. By the time the dark silhouette of the cabin finally came into view, my arms were burning with lactic acid, and my clothes were completely plastered to my skin. Grandpa Elijah had built this place with his own two hands, but years of abandonment had turned it into a haunting shadow of my warmest childhood memories. The wooden porch steps groaned in loud protest under my weight. The heavy front door was swollen shut from the relentless Georgia humidity, forcing me to ram my shoulder against the weathered wood 3 times just to force it open. Inside, the air was terribly stale and smelled heavily of wet pine and quiet decay. I fumbled frantically for the light switch on the wall, but flipping it up and down did absolutely nothing. The electricity had been shut off years ago. I pulled out my phone and used the flashlight app to slowly assess the damage. Thick gray dust coated every visible surface like a layer of dirty snow. Huge, elaborate cobwebs hung from the dark wooden rafters. The old plaid sofa where Grandpa used to sit and read to me was covered in a thick layer of grime and dead leaves that had blown down the chimney. I found a moth-eaten cedar chest in the corner, pulled out a surprisingly dry wool blanket, and wrapped it tightly around my shivering shoulders. I huddled on the floor in the corner of the living room. That first night was a freezing, terrifying blur of sheer exhaustion and silent tears. I listened to the harsh wind howl through the tiny cracks in the wooden walls, feeling smaller, more isolated, and more vulnerable than I ever had in my entire life. When the pale morning light finally broke through the grimy window panes, the brutal reality of my situation truly set in. I realized I had 2 choices. I could lay down on this dusty floor and let Donovan and his cruel family completely destroy me, or I could get up and get to work. I chose to work. I spent the next 4 grueling days engaged in relentless, back-breaking labor. My soft hands, which were entirely used to typing complex lines of code on a sleek aluminum laptop, quickly grew blistered raw and heavily calloused. I found an old metal bucket and a stiff scrub brush underneath the kitchen sink. I hauled heavy buckets of water from the freezing creek behind the property, boiling it slowly over a makeshift fire pit. I managed to dig in the overgrown backyard. I scrubbed the hardwood floors on my hands and knees until the beautiful original pine grain finally showed through the dirt. I cleared away the massive piles of debris, dragging rotten wood and broken chairs out to the yard. But the absolute biggest challenge was the plumbing. The old copper pipes under the kitchen sink had violently burst during a winter freeze years ago. I had zero money to call a professional plumber, so I was forced to rely on the mechanical logic my grandfather had patiently taught me when I was a little girl. I rummaged through his rusty metal toolbox out in the dilapidated shed, locating a heavy pipe wrench, some degraded plumber's tape, and a spare length of copper tubing. It took me 12 frustrating, agonizing hours of lying flat on my back on the damp, uneven floorboards, twisting severely rusted bolts, and getting covered in filthy, foul-smelling sludge. My back muscles screamed in constant protest. Every single time I accidentally hit my knuckles against the sharp, jagged wood of the lower cabinets, I thought of Vanessa and her mocking, condescending laughter in the courthouse parking lot. I used that burning anger as my primary fuel. When I finally walked outside, turned the main heavy iron water valve, and heard the loud, glorious sputter of water flowing steadily through the kitchen faucet without leaking underneath, I broke down and cried. They were not tears of sorrow or pity. It was a brief, intense moment of fierce, undeniable pride. I was surviving on my own terms. But just as I started to feel a tiny fraction of control over my hostile environment, my phone buzzed loudly against the clean kitchen counter. I had managed to charge it just enough using a cheap solar battery bank I found tucked inside my suitcase. The cracked screen lit up with a new text message from Donovan. My stomach immediately tied itself into tight, painful knots. I opened the message and a dozen high-resolution photos flooded my screen in rapid succession. He was proudly showing off his brand-new luxury penthouse in Midtown Atlanta. The vivid pictures displayed massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city skyline, a gigantic imported marble kitchen island, and a custom-built walk-in closet filled with designer suits. The final photo was a close-up selfie of him and Brielle. They were holding expensive crystal champagne flutes while standing on a sprawling glass balcony. She was wearing a stunning diamond necklace that looked suspiciously identical to the heirloom piece I had inherited from my grandmother, the very same necklace that mysteriously went missing right before the divorce proceedings began. The text message directly below the photos read, "Hope you are enjoying your new rustic living arrangements. By the way, my lawyers just finalized the latest accounting paperwork. You still owe me $2,000 for the administrative fees related to transferring the business assets. I need that money transferred by Friday afternoon. If you do not send it, I will have the court aggressively garnish your wages at your new job. Do not test me." I stared at the glowing screen, my blood boiling so hot I felt dizzy. He knew perfectly well that I had absolutely nothing left. He knew the software company I worked for was already threatening to let me go because the messy public divorce had severely impacted my daily performance. He was not just trying to take my last few dollars. He was actively trying to erase my ability to survive in society. He wanted to punish me endlessly for daring to exist outside of his narcissistic control. I threw the phone onto the sofa and began pacing the small cabin. A dark, heavy panic began to rise in my chest, threatening to completely choke me. $2,000 might as well have been $2 million to me right now. I had eaten nothing but plain instant oatmeal and cold canned beans for 6 straight days. I was constantly cold, deeply exhausted, and rapidly running out of basic survival supplies. The deep isolation of the woods, which had initially felt like a protective sanctuary, was rapidly turning into a terrifying psychological prison. By the 7th night, the temperature outside dropped significantly lower than before. The freezing wind battered the thin, fragile glass panes of the cabin windows, threatening to shatter them. I sat cross-legged on the floor, wrapping my arms tightly around my knees, shivering violently in the dark. My stomach grumbled with a sharp, hollow, agonizing ache. I looked around the dimly lit room, desperately searching for absolutely anything of value. I needed anything I could pawn or sell in town just to buy a cord of dry firewood and a week of decent groceries. My desperate eyes landed on the large, heavy-framed painting hanging high above the cold stone fireplace. It was a beautiful, intricate oil painting Grandpa Elijah had commissioned decades ago, depicting the two of us fishing quietly on a serene mountain lake. The painted canvas itself held deep, irreplaceable sentimental value, but the massive frame was crafted from thick, ornate, solid oak. It was a heavy, vintage antique piece that a pawn shop or art dealer in the nearest town might easily pay $100 for. I hated the very idea of dismantling the only truly beautiful thing left in the room, but creeping starvation leaves absolutely no room for sentimentality. I dragged a rickety wooden dining chair over to the stone fireplace and carefully climbed onto it. I reached my arms high up, my cold fingers tightly gripping the thick carved edges of the oak frame. I tried to lift it up and off the rusted iron nail, but my hands were completely numb from the biting cold, and my arms were severely weak from days of meager rations. The frame was much heavier than I initially anticipated. As I forcefully pulled it forward, the uneven wooden chair wobbled violently beneath my feet. I instantly lost my balance. My weak hands slipped from the smooth wood. The massive, heavy painting plummeted directly toward the floor. I jumped back wildly just in time to avoid getting my feet crushed. The heavy oak frame smashed brutally into the hardwood floor with a deafening explosive crack. The tremendous impact completely shattered the antique frame and violently snapped one of the old floorboards right down the middle. A huge cloud of ancient gray dust bloomed high into the freezing air. I dropped quickly to my knees, coughing loudly and waving the thick dust away from my face. I reached out to carefully pull the torn painted canvas from the jagged, splintered wood, my heart breaking completely at the sight of the ruined, beautiful memory. But as I pulled the heavy canvas aside, I noticed something incredibly strange. The violently broken floorboard had revealed a dark, deep, rectangular hollow space hidden directly beneath the floor. It was clearly not a random structural gap. It was a deliberately constructed hidden compartment, meticulously lined with metal sheet tin to keep the ground moisture out. My breath hit sharply in my throat. I reached my shaking hand down into the cold, dark space. My fingers brushed against something thick and smooth. I pulled it out carefully and held it up to the faint moonlight filtering through the dusty window. It was a large, heavy manila envelope. The flap was tightly sealed with a thick, heavy puddle of dark red wax, officially stamped with a distinct seal I recognized immediately as my late grandfather's old brass signet ring. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I turned the thick envelope over in the moonlight. Written boldly across the front in his unmistakable familiar handwriting were words that made the tiny hairs on my arms stand straight up. If you are reading this, it is because I am already gone. And if you are reading this, it means that fraud Donovan finally showed his true colors. I gasped loudly in the empty freezing room. The flashlight trembled in my cold hand, casting erratic shadows across the dusty floorboards. Grandpa Elijah had never openly criticized Donovan while he was alive. He had always sat quietly on the porch during our rare holiday visits, observing my ex-husband with sharp, calculating eyes. I always assumed he was just being a quiet, introverted old man who did not understand the modern corporate world. I was completely wrong. He understood everything. He saw right through the expensive tailored suits and the charismatic fraternity brother smile. The letter detailed exactly how Grandpa had secretly hired a private investigator 3 years ago. He knew Donovan was methodically siphoning my savings. He knew about the hidden shell companies, the offshore accounts, and the manipulated joint tax returns long before the divorce was even a dark thought in my mind. Grandpa wrote that he wanted desperately to warn me, but he also wrote that he saw how deeply, under Donovan's manipulative spell, I was back then. He knew that if he confronted Donovan without absolute bulletproof legal evidence, Donovan would simply gaslight me. He would convince me that my grandfather was just a paranoid old man. Donovan would use the conflict to isolate me even further from my family and potentially put my physical safety at immense risk. Donovan was a man deeply obsessed with his pristine public image. Men like that become extremely dangerous when they are cornered or exposed. So Grandpa chose a radically different path. He chose to prepare for the inevitable explosive collapse of my marriage. He spent the last few years of his life meticulously tracking the complex financial web Donovan was illegally weaving behind my back. The letter explained in shocking detail that Donovan's supposedly successful real estate firm was built entirely on a crumbling foundation of stolen funds. My funds, my bonuses from the software development firm, my late-night coding session paychecks. Grandpa wrote that he could not legally expose Donovan himself without risking my own total financial liability, since my name was legally tied up in the fraudulent prenuptial agreement Donovan had tricked me into signing. He needed to create an entirely separate safety net for me. He needed a fortress that Donovan and his high-priced aggressive lawyers could never touch, trace, or steal. A safety net hidden so deeply off the official grid that it would require my absolute total ruin to finally uncover it. Grandpa knew the divorce would leave me with nothing but this abandoned cabin. He knew I would eventually have to tear the place apart just to survive the freezing winter. It was a brutal, agonizing test of my resilience, but it was the absolute only way to ensure the timing of my revenge was perfectly executed. I reached deeper into the thick, heavy envelope. My frozen fingers brushed against cold, heavy, solid metal. I pulled out a large antique brass key. It was completely unlike the small modern silver keys used today. It was substantial, intricately carved and stamped with a long, specific sequence of numbers across the wide, curved bow. I held it up directly into the sharp beam of the flashlight. The brass gleamed faintly in the dark. It felt like a heavy, unmovable anchor in the chaotic, stormy sea of my ruined life. The letter continued with precise, unyielding instructions. This key belongs to a private, highly secure vault at the First Sovereign Bank in downtown Atlanta. It is a legacy trust account I opened 4 decades ago, under a corporate name that only you can legally access upon my death. Inside that vault is the leverage you will require to take back every single thing that was violently stolen from you, and then some. Do not trust anyone in your family. They will sell you out for a country club membership. Trust only my old friend Isaiah. He is the managing senior attorney at the law firm handling this trust. When the precise time comes, take this brass key directly to him. He will know exactly what to do next. The letter ended with a simple but incredibly powerful sentence. You carry the resilient blood of survivors. Charmaine, so dry, your tears fix your crown, and go claim your kingdom. I sat there on the splintered floorboards, clutching the heavy brass key tightly to my chest. The freezing wind howling viciously outside suddenly sounded much less intimidating. A profound, permanent shift occurred deep within my mind. For the past grueling week, I had viewed myself strictly as a tragic, helpless victim. I was the discarded, broken wife. I was the unwanted, disappointing daughter. I was the naive, hard-working woman who blindly let a narcissistic man steal her entire life's work. But Grandpa Elijah did not see me as a victim. He saw me as a fierce warrior who simply lacked the right weapon. This key was my weapon. I carefully folded the thick parchment paper and slipped it back into the wax-sealed envelope. I tucked the envelope securely into the hidden inside pocket of my thick wool coat. I placed the brass key deep into my front jeans pocket, pressing the cold metal firmly against my hip bone. The cold brass grounded me instantly. I was no longer the broke, desperate woman crying silently on the back of a city bus. I was the sole legal heir to a massive secret legacy. I slowly stood up, brushing the thick layer of ancient gray dust off my bruised knees. I needed to wait for the morning sun hike 2 miles back to the main dirt road and figure out exactly how to get to downtown Atlanta to find this attorney named Isaiah. My mind raced with endless strategic possibilities. I began calculating my next moves with the very same cold, analytical precision I used to write complex, predictive software algorithms. My tears were completely gone. The agonizing, hollow hunger in my stomach was entirely replaced by a burning, consuming fire for absolute justice. But my strategic, silent planning was abruptly and violently interrupted. A blinding flash of pure, harsh white light suddenly pierced the total darkness of the cabin. The intense high beam swept aggressively across the dusty front windows, casting long, terrifying, distorted shadows across the living room walls. I froze completely in my tracks. The low, powerful, aggressive rumble of a heavy engine echoed loudly through the quiet, isolated woods. I quickly clicked off my small flashlight, plunging myself instantly back into total protective darkness. I crept silently toward the front window, keeping my body low to the cold floorboards. I carefully peeked over the edge of the rotting wooden sill. A massive, sleek, black luxury SUV had just pulled into the muddy, overgrown driveway. The bright halogen headlights remained turned on, aggressively illuminating the entire front porch of my fragile wooden sanctuary. The heavy engine idled loudly, disturbing the peaceful night. My heart slammed fiercely against my ribs like a trapped bird. Nobody knew I was out here hiding except my parents back in Connecticut, and they had made it perfectly clear they wanted absolutely nothing to do with my situation. The heavy driver's side door swung open wide. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a tailored charcoal gray suit stepped out into the thick, ankle-deep mud. He looked down at his ruined, expensive Italian leather shoes with extreme, visible disgust. It was Donovan. A massive surge of pure, hot adrenaline flooded my veins. What was he doing here in the middle of the night? Why had he driven 2 grueling hours out of the city limits just to stand in the freezing mud at my broken-down door? My hands balled instinctively into tight, shaking fists. The passenger side door opened a second later. A woman stepped out holding a large designer umbrella to shield her perfectly styled, expensive hair from the biting wind. It was his sister, Vanessa. She was wearing a pristine white trench coat that looked completely ridiculous and highly inappropriate in the rugged wilderness setting. She shivered dramatically, crossing her arms tightly. I could hear her voice carrying clearly through the thin window glass. "Look at this disgusting dump, Donovan," she complained loudly. "I cannot believe you are wasting your valuable time driving out to this garbage heap. Just mail her the eviction papers and let the county sheriff drag her out of here." Donovan completely ignored her whining complaints. He reached into the luxurious leather back seat of the SUV and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of crisp white legal documents. They were clamped tightly together in an expensive leather binder. He slammed the heavy car door shut. The loud metallic sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent dark forest. He looked directly at the dark, unlit cabin. Even through the blinding glare of the halogen headlights, I could easily see the familiar, arrogant, confident smirk plastered across his handsome face. He thought he was hunting a severely wounded animal. He thought he was walking confidently into this abandoned cabin to deliver the final crushing fatal blow to my miserable existence. He marched confidently toward the creaking wooden porch steps, the thick stack of legal documents gripped tightly in his right hand. Vanessa followed closely behind him, clutching her expensive designer handbag tightly to her chest like a protective shield. They had actually tracked me down. But as I stood up straight in the dark cabin, feeling the heavy cold brass key resting safely against my hip, I realized they were making a massive fatal miscalculation. They had absolutely no idea they were walking straight into the lion's den. I stood perfectly still in the dark as heavy footsteps climbed the rotting wooden stairs of the porch. The steps groaned loudly under Donovan's weight. I took a deep breath, letting the freezing air fill my lungs to calm my racing heart. I reached out and unlocked the deadbolt with a loud metallic clack. I pulled the heavy wooden door open just a few inches, leaving the security chain firmly attached. The blinding glare of the SUV headlights poured through the narrow gap, severely hurting my eyes after days of living in near total darkness. Donovan was standing right on the other side of the threshold. Seeing his perfectly groomed face up close made my stomach twist with a violent mixture of familiar dread and brand new disgust. He was wearing a meticulously tailored charcoal gray suit that easily cost $3,000, paired with an expensive silk tie and a cashmere overcoat. The rain and wind did not seem to affect his flawless appearance at all. Standing right behind him, huddling under her massive designer umbrella, was Vanessa. She was clutching a pristine leather Birkin bag tightly to her chest, her face twisted in a deep, exaggerated scowl of sheer revulsion as she looked at the peeling paint of the cabin walls. Donovan looked at me through the narrow crack in the door. He took in my appearance, his eyes scanning my dusty, matted hair, my dirt-stained clothes, and my pale, shivering frame. A brief flash of deep satisfaction crossed his dark eyes, but he quickly masked it with an expression of profound, manufactured pity. He sighed heavily, acting like a deeply concerned friend rather than the man who had just systematically destroyed my entire life. "Charmaine, look at yourself," he said softly, using that smooth, hypnotic tone he always utilized when he was about to lie through his teeth. "You are freezing in here. There is no electricity, no heat, and the roof looks like it is about to completely cave in on your head. I know things ended incredibly badly between us in the courtroom, but I never wanted to see you living like a wild animal. I still care about what happens to you." I stared at him blankly, refusing to utter a single word. My silence clearly unnerved him just a fraction, but he quickly recovered his smooth composure. He took a small step closer to the door, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial whisper. "Listen to me carefully. I have some inside information from my contacts at the City Planning Commission. The County Council just quietly approved a massive new waste management facility. They are going to build a gigantic toxic landfill right next to this property line. Within 6 months, this entire area is going to be flooded with garbage trucks, hazardous chemical runoff, and unbearable industrial noise. This land is going to be completely worthless and totally uninhabitable." He reached inside the breast pocket of his expensive cashmere coat and pulled out a crisp rectangular piece of paper. He held it up to the crack in the door so the bright halogen headlights illuminated it perfectly. It was a certified cashier check printed from his primary business account. The bold black numbers printed on the line read exactly $10,000. "I am offering you a clean way out." Donovan continued, his voice dripping with fake generosity. "I will buy this useless cabin and the surrounding dirt from you right now for $10,000. It is a completely fair offer for a property that is about to become a toxic waste dump. Take this money, Charmaine." It is more than enough for you to put down a solid security deposit on a nice clean apartment in the city. You can buy a decent used car. You can get a hot meal and a warm bed tonight. You can finally start over and leave all this miserable family drama behind you. Just sign the deed transfer I brought with me and you can walk away from this disaster. I stood there in the freezing draft looking back and forth between his handsome lying face and the crisp $10,000 check. A week ago, before I found the letter behind the painting, I might have actually fallen for this incredibly manipulative performance. I might have desperately grabbed that check, tears streaming down my face, thanking him for his sudden act of bizarre mercy. I would have blindly signed away my grandfather's land just to escape the agonizing cold and the terrifying hunger. But right now, the heavy antique brass key was pressing firmly against my hip bone like a shield of absolute truth. I remembered every single word Grandpa Elijah had written in that wax-sealed envelope. He warned me that Donovan was a master illusionist. He warned me that Donovan only moved when there was massive hidden profit to be made. I let my eyes slowly drift away from the check. I looked closely at his bespoke $3,000 suit. I looked at his perfectly polished Italian leather shoes, sinking into the filthy porch mud. I looked at Vanessa aggressively protecting her $5,000 designer handbag from the light drizzle. These were people deeply obsessed with elite social status and high-end luxury. Real estate developers of Donovan's caliber do not drive 2 hours into the freezing rural wilderness in the middle of the night just to hand their ex-wives a generous charity check out of the goodness of their hearts. And more importantly, millionaire corporate developers do not buy toxic waste dumps. They buy gold mines. They buy hidden leverage. They buy things that are about to make them exponentially richer. Donovan did not want this land to help me get on my feet. He needed this land desperately for something massive, and he was absolutely terrified that I was going to find out what it was before he could steal it from me. I reached my hand through the narrow gap in the door. Donovan smiled a wide, victorious smile, clearly believing his psychological manipulation had worked perfectly. He eagerly handed the crisp cashier check over to me, already turning his head to signal Vanessa to hand him the leather binder with the deed transfer paperwork. I held the thick paper between my freezing fingers. It represented warmth, food, and temporary safety, but it also represented total surrender to a monster. I looked Donovan directly in the eye, my expression completely devoid of any fear or intimidation. I did not break eye contact as I closed my hands together and forcefully tore the $10,000 check directly down the middle. Donovan froze completely, his victorious smile instantly vanishing into thin air. I placed the two torn halves together and ripped them again, tearing the heavy paper into tiny, jagged quarters. I pushed my hand back out through the crack in the door and opened my fingers. The torn pieces of the check fluttered down like dead leaves, landing directly in the thick, wet mud covering his expensive Italian shoes. My voice was calm, low, and completely steady. "Get off my property." The silence that followed was incredibly thick and heavy. Donovan stared at the torn pieces of paper in the mud, his mind clearly struggling to process the fact that the broke, starving woman he thought he had completely broken was suddenly defying him. But before he could even open his mouth to respond, Vanessa completely lost her temper. Her fake polite demeanor shattered into a million pieces. She pushed past her brother, her face red with absolute rage, her voice screeching loudly into the quiet night. "You are just as stupid as that old man was," she yelled hysterically, pointing a sharp manicured finger right at my face through the gap in the door. Grandpa Elijah was a stubborn, uneducated fool who refused to sell this garbage land when he had the chance, and he died with absolutely nothing. "We are trying to save you from living in the gutter, and this is how you repay us. You arrogant, ungrateful brat. Enjoy losing this dump to the state, because nobody is going to save you now." I did not flinch at her loud, vicious insults. I just stared at her with a look of pure, cold indifference, which only seemed to make her much angrier. She grabbed Donovan by the arm and pulled him back toward the stairs. "Let us go, Donovan," she snapped angrily. "Leave her here to rot. She is not worth another second of our valuable time." Donovan did not move immediately. His charming nice guy mask had completely fallen away, revealing the cold, calculating predator lurking underneath. His eyes darkened with pure, furious malice. The jaw muscle in his face twitched uncontrollably. He realized that his easy, cheap plan had just failed spectacularly. He reached out and snatched the thick leather binder away from his sister. He opened it aggressively and pulled out a heavy stack of official-looking documents stamped with the bold red seal of the county clerk office. He held the documents up, a dark, menacing smirk slowly spreading across his face. "You think you are so smart, Charmaine," he said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, threatening register. "You think staying out here makes you strong. But you do not know the first thing about the real world. You should have taken the money when I was being nice." He forcefully shoved the thick stack of papers through the narrow crack in the door. The heavy documents hit my chest and scattered across the dusty floorboards of the cabin interior. I looked down at the bold printed heading on the top page. It was an official notice of a county tax lien. "Suit yourself," Donovan sneered, stepping backward down the rotting wooden stairs. "But you should probably read that paperwork before you freeze to death tonight. It seems your beloved grandfather was not very good at paying his property taxes before he died. You currently owe $50,000 in back taxes and severe municipal penalties. The county court has already approved the foreclosure. You have exactly 14 days to pay the entire balance in full. If the money is not wired to the county clerk by the deadline, the state will aggressively seize this cabin, auction off the land, and physically drag you off the premises." He turned around and walked confidently back to the massive luxury SUV, his expensive shoes leaving deep, messy tracks in the mud. Vanessa was already sitting in the passenger seat, glaring at me through the tinted glass. Donovan climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the heavy door shut, and aggressively threw the vehicle into reverse. The tires spun wildly in the wet dirt, throwing mud everywhere before the SUV sped off into the darkness, leaving me alone once again in the freezing silence of the forest. I closed the heavy wooden door, locked the deadbolt, and knelt down on the cold floorboards. I gathered the scattered official documents and shined my flashlight on the pages. The tax lien looked incredibly official. The numbers were terrifying. $50,000. It was a massive, insurmountable mountain of debt for someone who only had $42 to her name. But as I read the fine print, my analytical mind immediately caught several glaring discrepancies. The dates did not align properly with state tax cycles. The filing signatures looked hastily stamped. Donovan had deep connections with corrupt city officials. He had clearly called in a massive favor to forge an expedited tax lien, creating an artificial emergency to panic me into selling the land to him immediately. He thought this forged document was his ultimate checkmate. He thought he had successfully backed me into an inescapable corner where I would be forced to surrender my inheritance. He had no idea that his aggressive, desperate actions had just confirmed everything Grandpa Elijah had written in his letter. Donovan was on a strict ticking clock. He needed this exact plot of land right now, which meant whatever he was hiding was massive, lucrative, and highly vulnerable. I folded the fake tax lien and placed it neatly next to the wax-sealed envelope on the counter. 14 days was a very tight window, but it was more than enough time for me to execute my next move. Tomorrow morning, I was going to find attorney Isaiah, open that secure bank vault, and finally discover exactly what kind of invisible kingdom my grandfather had built. The morning sun broke through the cloudy sky, casting long, pale shadows across the muddy yard of the cabin. I did not sleep a single wink after Donovan and Vanessa drove away. I spent the remaining hours of the dark night meticulously cleaning myself up as best as I could with freezing water and a stiff washcloth. I brushed the dried mud off my coat, tied my hair back tightly, and placed the forged tax lien and my grandfather's letter securely inside my bag. The heavy brass key remained safely tucked in my pocket. The 2-mile hike back to the main dirt road was grueling. My muscles ached from the previous days of intense manual labor, and my stomach twisted with lingering hunger, but a fierce new energy propelled me forward. I caught the early commuter bus, heading straight into the heart of downtown Atlanta. I watched the rural landscape slowly transform into sprawling suburbs and eventually into the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district. I stepped off the bus right in front of the First Sovereign Bank. It was a massive, imposing structure, built entirely of white marble and thick granite columns. It looked like an ancient fortress. I walked through the heavy revolving glass doors, instantly feeling hyper-aware of my worn-out clothes and scuffed boots against the pristine, polished floors. The main lobby was filled with wealthy corporate clients wearing expensive tailored suits, loudly discussing stock portfolios and real estate acquisitions. I took a deep, steadying breath, gripped the strap of my cheap bag, and walked straight up to the mahogany front desk. I asked the receptionist for Attorney Isaiah. She looked me up and down with a thinly veiled expression of polite disdain and asked if I had a scheduled appointment. Before I could even answer, a deep, resonant voice echoed across the quiet lobby. "You must be Charmaine." I turned around and saw a tall, distinguished older black man walking toward me. He was wearing a sharply tailored navy blue suit and gold-rimmed glasses. His hair was completely silver, neatly trimmed, and his eyes held a profound depth of intelligence and quiet warmth. He extended a firm hand. "I am Isaiah. I have been waiting a very long time for you to walk through those doors." I shook his hand, feeling a sudden immense wave of relief wash over my tired body. He did not judge my appearance or ask unnecessary questions. He simply gestured for me to follow him. We walked past the busy teller stations and approached a set of heavy steel doors guarded by an armed security officer. Isaiah swiped a keycard and placed his thumb on a biometric scanner. The heavy doors hissed open, revealing a softly lit subterranean level lined with thousands of numbered steel lockboxes. We walked down the quiet carpeted hallway until we reached a private viewing room enclosed by thick, reinforced glass. Isaiah instructed me to hand him the brass key. I pulled the cold, heavy metal from my pocket and placed it carefully into his outstretched palm. He walked over to a massive steel wall panel, inserted his own master key into the top slot, and then inserted my grandfather's brass key into the bottom slot. He turned them both simultaneously. A loud, heavy metallic clunk echoed through the room. He pulled out a long, deep metal lockbox and placed it gently onto the polished oak table in the center of the viewing room. He stepped back and nodded politely. "This is entirely yours," he said quietly. Elijah gave me strict instructions to never open it myself. I am merely the legal guardian of the trust. My hands shook slightly as I reached out and lifted the heavy metal lid. Given the dramatic buildup and the immense secrecy, my desperate, exhausted mind had naturally expected to see neat stacks of crisp $100 bills or perhaps heavy bars of solid gold. I needed immediate liquid cash to stop the forged county tax lien Donovan had maliciously slapped on the cabin. But as I looked inside the dark box, my heart sank just a fraction. There was no money, there was no gold. The box was completely filled with thick stacks of aged yellowing paper. They were densely typed legal documents, stock certificates, and old property deeds. They were all registered under a mysterious corporate entity named E&C Holdings. I carefully lifted the top stack of papers and flipped through the dense legal jargon. "I do not understand," I whispered, feeling a sudden cold wave of intense panic rising in my chest. "Grandpa said this box held my kingdom. He said it held the leverage I needed to fight back. But these are just old corporate documents. Donovan just hit me with a $50,000 tax lien. He has city officials in his pocket. He has millions of dollars to burn. How am I supposed to fight him with a box full of old paper?" I looked up at Isaiah, my eyes wide with desperate confusion. Isaiah smiled a slow, deeply knowing smile. He pulled out a leather chair and gestured for me to sit down. He took the seat directly across from me, his expression turning intensely serious. "Your grandfather was a brilliant man, Charmaine." Most people looked at Elijah and only saw a quiet, retired mechanic with grease permanently stained into his fingernails. They thought he was just a simple blue-collar worker who liked to fish on the weekends. They severely underestimated his intellect. While they were busy showing off their fancy cars and expensive country club memberships, Elijah was quietly listening. He was saving every extra dime. He was studying the intricate local laws of property development in Georgia. Isaiah leaned forward and tapped his index finger firmly against the stack of papers in my hand. 40 years ago, the county was practically giving away land on the outskirts of the city. Nobody wanted it because it was heavily forested and completely underdeveloped. Elijah foresaw the eventual massive urban sprawl of Atlanta, but he also knew that buying the surface land was incredibly expensive and heavily taxed. So he did something absolutely genius. He incorporated E&C Holdings, and through that completely anonymous shell company, he aggressively purchased the absolute mineral and water rights to 500 contiguous acres of prime suburban land. I stared at him blankly, struggling to grasp the full magnitude of his words. Water rights, I asked slowly, the gears in my analytical mind beginning to turn rapidly. Exactly! Isaiah confirmed, his voice vibrating with barely contained excitement. In the state of Georgia, property rights are often severed. A person can own the surface dirt, the trees, and the physical buildings on top of the land. But a completely different entity can own whatever lies beneath the surface. For 4 decades, your grandfather quietly paid the minimal administrative fees to maintain total absolute legal control over the subterranean water aquifers and the mineral deposits beneath those specific 500 acres. Any developer who buys the surface land cannot legally dig a deep foundation drill, a functional well, or establish a commercial water line without the express written legal consent of the water rights holder. And as of yesterday, when you opened that letter, you became the sole acting executive director of E&C Holdings. You hold the ultimate keys to the earth beneath their feet. The sheer scale of what Grandpa Elijah had done slowly began to wash over me. He had not left me a simple cash inheritance that Donovan could easily trace and steal in a messy divorce settlement. He had left me an invisible, indestructible weapon. But I still did not fully understand why Donovan was suddenly so incredibly desperate to buy my tiny broken-down cabin in the woods for $10,000. I pulled the forged tax lien from my bag and slid it across the table to Isaiah. Donovan showed up at the cabin last night. I explained, my voice growing stronger with every single word. He tried to buy the property for a ridiculously low price. When I refused, he threatened me with this expedited tax foreclosure. He claimed the city was building a toxic waste facility nearby. If I own the water rights to 500 random acres of suburban land, why is he suddenly attacking my specific cabin? Isaiah picked up the fake tax lien, adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, and scanned the document. He scoffed loudly, shaking his head in absolute disgust. This is a remarkably sloppy forgery. Donovan is acting out of pure, unadulterated panic. He is making careless, desperate mistakes because he is completely running out of time. Isaiah reached into his leather briefcase resting on the floor and pulled out a large, tightly rolled architectural blueprint. He spread the heavy blue paper flat across the oak table, using the heavy metal lockbox to weigh down one of the corners. Look closely at this map, Charmaine. Isaiah pointed to a large highlighted section covered in complex topographical lines and proposed building structures. This is Donovan's highly publicized brand new crown jewel. This is the massive project that is currently keeping his entire development firm afloat. It is a $100 million luxury eco-resort named the Oasis. It features a massive man-made lake, an 18-hole championship golf course, and 200 luxury villas with private heated pools. It is being entirely financed by the billionaire father of his new fiancée, Brielle. They have already broken ground. They have already poured millions of dollars into the concrete foundations. My eyes scanned the complex blueprint, taking in the massive scale of the luxurious resort. It was exactly the kind of pretentious high-end project Donovan always dreamed of building. But as my eyes drifted toward the exact geographical coordinates printed neatly in the bottom right corner of the blueprint, my breath hitched violently in my throat. I recognized the surrounding roads. I recognized the shape of the nearby county lines. Isaiah tapped his finger directly on the center of the resort map. The exact 500 acres where Donovan is currently building the Oasis is the exact same 500 acres where your grandfather owns the absolute water rights. Donovan purchased the surface land from a third-party holding company 2 years ago. He was so arrogant, so incredibly eager to impress his wealthy new father-in-law that he completely failed to run a proper deep title search on the subterranean rights. He only discovered his massive catastrophic error 3 weeks ago when he applied for the commercial municipal water permits, and the county clerk instantly rejected his application. A sharp, triumphant laugh suddenly escaped my lips. The brilliant, magnificent trap Grandpa Elijah had set was finally snapping shut. Donovan's entire $100 million eco-resort was fundamentally dependent on massive amounts of water. You cannot have a man-made lake, a lush green golf course, or 200 private luxury pools without millions of gallons of water. He is completely paralyzed, Isaiah said, a fierce, proud smile breaking across his face. He cannot legally extract a single drop of water from that land without your signature. Without water, his luxury eco-resort is nothing but a dry, useless pile of incredibly expensive concrete. His billionaire investors will absolutely slaughter him when they find out he built a water resort on land with no water access. He tried to buy your grandfather's cabin last night because the original deed to the cabin is legally bundled with the master portfolio of E&C Holdings. He thought he could trick you into signing away the cabin, thereby quietly transferring the water rights to his firm, without you ever realizing what you actually sold him. The pieces of the complex puzzle finally clicked perfectly into place. Donovan was not a powerful, untouchable corporate titan. He was a desperate, terrified fraud standing on the edge of a massive financial cliff. He had stolen my savings, ruined my credit, and thrown me out into the freezing rain with nothing but 2 cheap suitcases. He thought he had completely buried me, but he had absolutely no idea that he had just built his entire glittering empire directly on top of my heavily fortified kingdom. I looked down at the lockbox full of old yellowing paper. I gently touched the stock certificates of E&C Holdings. A deep, powerful calm settled over my entire spirit. The freezing nights, the physical pain, and the bitter humiliation of the past week completely vanished. I looked up at Isaiah, my eyes burning with cold, calculated determination. "When does Donovan officially announce the grand opening of this resort to his investors?" I asked quietly. Isaiah checked his sleek silver wristwatch. "Tomorrow night. He is hosting a massive, lavish engagement party at the Buckhead Country Club. Brielle's billionaire father is flying in all of his wealthy friends to celebrate the upcoming wedding and to officially unveil the final architectural models for the oasis. It is going to be the biggest high society event of the entire year." I smiled, feeling the heavy burden of victimhood finally lift off my shoulders for good. "Well then," I said softly, carefully gathering the precious documents and placing them back inside the heavy metal lockbox. "It would be incredibly rude of me not to attend my own ex-husband's engagement party, especially since I am technically his most important business partner. Let us go shopping, Isaiah. I need a dress that shows them exactly who they are dealing with." Isaiah chuckled, a rich, deep sound that echoed warmly within the cold steel walls of the bank vault. He securely locked the metal box and guided me back out into the bustling main lobby. Before we hit the high-end boutiques of Buckhead, he insisted we make a brief stop at his law firm just 2 blocks away. He needed me to sign the official executive director documents for E&C Holdings to legally solidify my absolute authority. Sitting in his plush corner office overlooking the sprawling Atlanta skyline, Isaiah poured us both a glass of sparkling water and broke down the exact legal mechanics of the trap my ex-husband was currently caught in. According to strict Georgia state environmental regulations, Isaiah explained, pointing a silver pen at a thick leather-bound legal book on his desk, commercial developers face incredibly rigid zoning laws regarding natural resource extraction. Donovan cannot simply drill a single well on that 500-acre property. He cannot legally connect the county municipal water lines to his luxury eco-resort without submitting a fully signed, authorized consent form from the registered water rights holder. The county clerk office is completely ruthless about this specific statute to prevent massive corporate exploitation of local aquifers. And because E&C Holdings is a registered private trust, the county cannot use eminent domain to quickly force a sale without initiating a massive, highly publicized federal legal battle. I sat back in the soft leather chair and let the cool, sparkling water soothe my dry throat. The sheer magnitude of my leverage was absolutely staggering. Donovan was actively building a $100 million oasis. He had already sold his billionaire investors on the promise of shimmering artificial lakes, lush green golf courses, and cascading waterfalls. But without my signature, his so-called oasis was legally destined to remain a dry, barren wasteland. He had effectively built a massive gleaming mansion in the middle of a desert without securing a single drop of water. The setup was almost painfully poetic. I finally realized exactly why Donovan had been acting so incredibly erratic and desperate over the last few days. He had finalized our brutal divorce and thrown me out on the street with absolutely nothing. But right after the judge slammed the gavel, his corporate lawyers must have finally run the deep geological title search required for the final construction permits. I could vividly imagine the sheer absolute terror freezing Donovan's blood when he realized the abandoned cabin property he had just intentionally excluded from our divorce settlement was actually the legal key to his entire empire. He had tried to buy the cabin from me for a miserable $10,000 because he urgently needed to acquire my land to secure those water rights before his wealthy investors found out his resort was essentially a useless pile of expensive bricks. When his pathetic lowball offer completely failed, his panic must have skyrocketed. That was exactly why he immediately returned with a forged county tax lien. He was trying to artificially accelerate the foreclosure process so he could quietly buy the land at a rigged county auction before I ever realized its true astronomical value. He was fighting for his corporate life. His entire reputation, his new engagement, and his billionaire father-in-law's massive investment were all dangling precariously by a single thin thread that I was currently holding in my hand. Isaiah slid a sleek black folder across his mahogany desk. Now that you are officially the active executive director of the holding company, the trust allows for immediate discretionary capital disbursements. Your grandfather left a small liquid cash reserve attached to the account specifically for administrative expenses. I took the liberty of transferring $25,000 to a secure corporate debit card for your immediate personal use. We can access the larger funds next week, but this should be more than enough to handle your current wardrobe emergency. I stared at the heavy black metal card resting on the desk. Just 12 hours ago, I was shivering violently in a dusty cabin, desperately trying to pull a heavy, antique frame off the wall just to buy a cheap can of beans. Now I was holding the financial equivalent of a loaded weapon. I thanked Isaiah profusely, took the card, and left his office with my head held high. I hailed a cab and directed the driver straight to Phipps Plaza, the most exclusive luxury shopping center in the heart of Buckhead. Walking into the high-end designer boutiques, I was initially met with the same condescending, judgmental stares I had endured my entire marriage. My clothes were still severely wrinkled and stained with cabin mud. My hair was wild and unkempt. A sharply dressed sales associate at a famous European fashion house immediately stepped in my path, clearly intending to politely escort me right back out the front door. But before she could utter a single condescending word, I silently handed her the heavy black corporate card. Her eyes widened slightly as she recognized the elite banking tier. Her entire demeanor changed in an absolute instant. Suddenly, I was not a homeless woman wandering off the street. I was a highly valued VIP client. I spent the next 4 hours undergoing a complete and total transformation. I did not just want to look beautiful. I wanted to look dangerous. I wanted to look like a woman who could effortlessly dismantle a corporate empire before finishing her first glass of champagne. I visited an exclusive salon where a team of top-tier stylists washed the heavy grime from my hair, treating it with expensive oils until it cascaded down my back in perfect, sleek, dark waves. A professional makeup artist expertly erased the deep, exhausted shadows from under my eyes, highlighting my sharp cheekbones and applying a bold, deep crimson lipstick that felt like pure liquid armor. But the absolute masterpiece was the dress. I walked into a private VIP fitting room and tried on a dozen stunning gowns before I found the exact one. It was a custom-tailored emerald green silk gown that hugged my curves perfectly. The rich, vibrant color was a deliberate, calculated choice. It was the exact shade of green my mother had always forbidden me to wear as a child, claiming it was too flashy for a girl of my background. The dress featured a sharp, elegant neckline and a dangerously high slit up the left leg. It screamed immense wealth, absolute confidence, and total control. I paired it with towering, strappy gold stilettos and a sleek, minimalist gold clutch. When I finally looked at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror, I did not recognize the broken, weeping woman who had walked out of the courthouse just 1 week ago. Staring back at me was the formidable executive director of E&C Holdings. I was Charmaine, the undeniable queen of the board. I paid the astronomical bill without blinking an eye and walked out of the mall as the evening sun began to set over the Atlanta skyline. Isaiah had insisted on sending his private town car to pick me up. The sleek black vehicle pulled up to the curb, and a uniformed driver respectfully opened the rear door for me. I slid into the luxurious leather back seat, the soft interior lighting illuminating the dark-tinted windows. I gave the driver the address for the Buckhead Country Club. The ride took less than 20 minutes, but every single second felt incredibly charged with electric anticipation. As the town car smoothly navigated the winding manicured roads leading up to the elite country club, I mentally prepared myself for the battlefield ahead. Donovan and his arrogant sister Vanessa had spent years systematically trying to break my spirit. They had mocked my working-class background. They had called me a project girl who braided hair to survive. They thought I was completely devoid of power or resources. Tonight they were hosting the most exclusive high society event of the entire year. The parking lot was already completely packed with expensive imported sports cars and massive luxury SUVs. The grand ballroom windows glowed with warm golden light, and the faint sound of a live string quartet drifted through the crisp evening air. This was Donovan's ultimate moment of glory. He was about to stand up in front of Atlanta's most powerful elite circles and proudly present a massive real estate project that he did not actually have the legal right to build. He was going to kiss his beautiful, young, wealthy fiancée and promise her father massive returns on his $100 million investment. He thought his secrets were safely buried in the mud of my grandfather's cabin. He was so incredibly wrong. The town car slowly pulled up to the grand front entrance of the country club. The valet rushed forward to open my door. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the cool evening air brush against my bare shoulders. I stepped out of the vehicle, my gold stilettos clicking sharply against the polished cobblestone driveway. Armed with the absolute knowledge of my hidden legacy and wearing a dress that cost more than Donovan's forged tax lien, I walked confidently past the massive marble columns. I was fully prepared to crash the party of the decade and watch my ex-husband's fragile house of cards completely collapse. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung open before me, pulled back by two white-gloved attendants who naturally assumed I was a distinguished, highly anticipated guest. The sheer breathtaking opulence of the room hit me instantly, like a physical wave. Crystal chandeliers hung heavily from the towering vaulted ceilings, casting a brilliant, shimmering golden light over hundreds of Atlanta's most elite, wealthy socialites. Waiters dressed in crisp black tuxedos circulated gracefully through the crowd, with silver trays holding imported vintage champagne and expensive beluga caviar. A massive, elaborate ice sculpture of two swans forming a perfect heart dominated the absolute center of the expansive room, slowly dripping cold water onto a bed of fresh imported orchids. I stepped onto the plush crimson carpet, the emerald silk of my custom designer gown, flowing seamlessly behind me with every calculated, deliberate step. My towering gold stilettos made absolutely no sound against the thick carpet, but my physical presence immediately commanded the attention of the entire room. Heads began to turn rapidly in my direction. The low hum of polite, arrogant conversations slowly faded into hushed, intrigued whispers as people desperately tried to place exactly who I was. I recognized many of their faces as I walked slowly past their lavishly decorated tables. They were the very same wealthy real estate investors, local corrupt politicians, and country club regulars who had blatantly ignored me or offered cruel backhanded compliments during my entire 8-year marriage to Donovan. Back then, I was just the quiet, dutiful background wife wearing clearance rack dresses, desperately trying to shrink myself into the wallpaper so Donovan could shine brightly in the spotlight. Tonight, I was a walking total eclipse. I scanned the massive, elegant ballroom with cold, predatory precision, my heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm of absolute control. It did not take me very long to find my specific targets. The VIP table was strategically situated on a slightly elevated dais at the far end of the room, offering them a perfect royal view of their wealthy, admiring guests. Donovan sat right in the center, looking sickeningly smug and triumphant in a custom-tailored white dinner jacket that probably cost more than the cabin he tried to steal from me. Next to him was his new young fiancée, Brielle, draped heavily in a glittering silver gown that looked incredibly expensive but entirely ostentatious and desperate for attention. She was laughing loudly, throwing her head back playfully, and clinging tightly to Donovan's arm, like he was a massive prized trophy she had just proudly won at an auction. On her other side sat a stern-looking older man with thick silver hair, a sharp tailored black suit, and cold, calculating eyes. I knew instantly from the extensive, meticulous financial research Isaiah and I had done that this was Reginald. He was Brielle's billionaire father and the primary financial backer for the massive Oasis resort project. Sitting right next to Donovan was his older sister, Vanessa, wearing a flashy bright red dress and sipping pink champagne with a deeply self-satisfied, arrogant smirk. They looked like the absolute picture-perfect representation of high society triumph and generational wealth. They genuinely thought they had successfully erased my entire existence, stolen my life savings, and secured their glamorous future without facing a single consequence. I began my long, slow walk across the polished ballroom floor, cutting a direct path straight through the sea of whispering guests. I did not rush my steps. I did not glare angrily at anyone. I kept my posture flawlessly straight, my shoulders pulled back, my chin held incredibly high, and a faint, serene, confident smile playing perfectly on my lips. As I drew closer to the elevated VIP table, Vanessa was the very first person to actually spot me approaching. Her crystal champagne flute stopped completely halfway to her mouth. Her dark eyes widened in absolute sheer shock, her jaw dropping slightly as she took in my expensive designer gown, my flawless professional makeup, and my completely transformed, powerful appearance. She nudged Donovan frantically in the ribs, spilling a few drops of her expensive drink onto the white tablecloth. He turned his head, a charming, practiced frat boy smile, already fully prepared for whoever was approaching their exclusive table. But that fake charming smile instantly died on his face. The healthy color completely drained from his cheeks in a matter of seconds. He looked exactly as if he had just seen a terrifying ghost, rising directly from the polished floorboards to drag him straight to hell. I reached the edge of the elevated dais and stopped perfectly still right in front of their lavish table. The live string quartet in the corner of the room was still playing a soft, romantic classical melody, but the heavy, tense silence at the VIP table was absolutely deafening. Donovan opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He just stared at me with wide, terrified, panicked eyes, his hands trembling slightly against the white linen tablecloth. Brielle, however, quickly recovered from her initial shock. She looked me up and down her heavily manicured eyebrows, narrowing with deep malicious intent and extreme territorial jealousy. She clearly felt the desperate, urgent need to establish her social dominance in front of her wealthy father and their hundreds of elite guests. "Well, look exactly who decided to crash the party," Brielle announced loudly, intentionally projecting her sharp voice so it carried clearly to the surrounding tables and drew even more attention to us. I am honestly surprised the security guards let you pass the front iron gates, Charmaine. Did you manage to find that flashy green dress at a local thrift store, or did you have to pawn your cheap little wedding ring just to rent it for the night? You really should not be here humiliating yourself like this. This exclusive event is for actual wealthy investors, not desperate bitter ex-wives looking for a free meal and a handout. Her loud, cruel words were specifically designed to publicly humiliate me and put me back in what she believed was my proper inferior place. She was intentionally trying to remind everyone in the room of my working-class background. During my marriage, Donovan had frequently and cruelly complained to Brielle about how I used to buy my clothes from discount clearance racks just to save extra money for our shared future business goals. He had maliciously weaponized my frugal sacrifices, twisting my hard work into embarrassing, pathetic anecdotes to entertain his wealthy new girlfriend behind my back. Brielle fully expected me to blush deeply, stutter nervously, and run away in tears of shame, just like the old, fragile Charmaine would have done. But the old, fragile Charmaine died the exact moment she found that wax-sealed envelope hidden in the freezing cabin. I completely ignored Brielle. I did not even grant her the basic dignity of a sideways glance or a witty defensive comeback. She was nothing but a clueless, entitled pawn in a much larger, dangerous game. My cold, analytical eyes completely bypassed Donovan's pale, terrified face and locked directly onto Reginald. The billionaire patriarch was carefully watching the entire dramatic exchange with a deep, severe frown, clearly unamused by the sudden dramatic interruption to his expensive, elegant evening. He was a ruthless veteran businessman who only cared about hard facts, verifiable numbers, and solid, profitable investments. I reached my hand calmly into my sleek, minimalist gold clutch. I pulled out a thick, heavy, folded legal document. It was the official court injunction Isaiah had drafted and formally filed with the state court just a few hours ago, bearing the bold, unmistakable red stamp of the Georgia State Environmental Registry and the raised seal of the county clerk. I took one confident step forward and smoothly slid the heavy document directly across the pristine white linen tablecloth. It glided effortlessly past Brielle's massive diamond engagement ring and stopped perfectly right in front of Reginald's crystal water glass. Reginald looked down at the thick document and then slowly looked back up at me. His sharp, calculating eyes narrowed with intense, deep suspicion. "What exactly is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice low, gravelly, and commanding ultimate absolute authority over the entire table. I offered him a sweet, devastatingly calm smile. "Good evening, Reginald," I said smoothly, my voice projecting clearly and confidently over the soft classical music playing in the background. "I am Charmaine, the executive director and sole legal owner of E&C Holdings. I highly suggest you thoroughly audit your future son-in-law before you sign another massive investment check. He is currently building your $100 million luxury eco-resort on protected land with absolutely no legal water access." The words hung heavily in the air like a dropped bomb. Brielle scoffed loudly, clearly not understanding the massive, catastrophic legal implications of my statement. "What are you even talking about, you crazy woman?" she snapped aggressively, slamming her hand on the table. "Donovan owns that entire property outright. You are just completely delusional and making things up because you are insanely jealous of our success and our happiness." But Reginald did not laugh. He did not scoff or defend Donovan. He was a seasoned real estate veteran who instantly recognized the severe, catastrophic threat of a severed rights title issue. He quickly snatched the heavy legal document off the table and flipped it open. His eyes rapidly scanned the bold legal text, the registered parcel numbers, the specific topographical coordinates, and the official state seals, confirming my absolute ownership of the subterranean aquifers. His face rapidly hardened into a terrifying mask of pure cold fury. "The project is officially paralyzed as of this morning," I continued, my tone remaining perfectly polite and smoothly conversational. "My corporation holds the exclusive perpetual water rights to the exact 500 acres your resort currently sits on. According to state law, Donovan cannot drill a single well, build a single lake, or connect a single county municipal pipe without my express written legal consent. And I can assure you, Reginald, that consent will never be granted under any circumstances. Your massive, beautiful eco-resort is legally destined to be nothing more than a dry, barren, incredibly expensive desert. Donovan abruptly jumped out of his chair, nearly knocking over his crystal champagne flute in his blind, rising panic. "Reginald, wait," he stammered desperately, holding his trembling hands up in a defensive, pleading gesture. "Do not listen to her. She is lying to you. She is just a bitter, crazy woman trying to illegally extort us for cash. I have my top corporate lawyers actively handling this minor administrative issue right now as we speak. We can easily bypass her fake shell company. It is just a tiny paperwork error from the previous owners. I swear to you, it is fully under control, and the construction will continue tomorrow." Reginald slowly lowered the document and turned his head to look directly at Donovan. The billionaire's eyes were completely devoid of any warmth or future familial affection. "Minor administrative issue." Reginald repeated, his voice dangerously soft and incredibly deadly. "You call building a massive luxury water resort on land you do not actually fully own a minor administrative issue. You came into my home, you asked for my daughter's hand in marriage, and you explicitly promised me that the property title was completely clear and fully secured. You took $50 million of my initial investment capital to pour massive concrete foundations for a lake that legally cannot hold a single drop of water." Donovan physically, visibly shrank under the intense, crushing weight of the billionaire's absolute fury. His entire pristine, confident facade crumbled into pathetic dust right before my eyes. The charming frat boy smile was entirely gone, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated terror of a massive fraud who had just been publicly caught in his own complex trap. Vanessa sat completely frozen in her chair, her face ashen white, entirely unable to process how the broke girl she had mocked in the rain was currently dismantling their entire family legacy with a single piece of paper. I took one graceful step back from the table, my mission perfectly and flawlessly accomplished. I did not need to scream, cry, or throw a drink in anyone's face. True power moved in absolute silence, just like Grandpa Elijah had taught me. I gave Reginald a polite, respectful nod, completely ignoring the chaotic, panicked arguing that was rapidly breaking out between him, Donovan, and Brielle. "Enjoy the rest of your elegant evening," I said softly, turning my back on the VIP table. I walked away with the exact same slow, confident grace I had entered with, leaving Donovan totally trapped in the burning wreckage of his own arrogant creation. I walked out of the Buckhead Country Club and into the cool night air, the heavy oak doors closing firmly behind me to completely muffle the chaotic shouting I had just ignited inside the grand ballroom. The valet immediately brought the sleek black town car around. I slid into the luxurious leather-back seat and instructed the driver to take me straight back to the rural cabin. I could have easily afforded a 5-star hotel suite in the city with the corporate funds Isaiah had provided, but I desperately needed to return to the woods. That dusty, dilapidated cabin was the very place where my grandfather had carefully laid the brilliant foundation for my revenge. It grounded me. It reminded me exactly why I was fighting this brutal war. When I finally arrived, I changed out of the stunning emerald gown, wrapped myself in the thick wool blanket, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep for the first time in an entire week. But my quiet, peaceful victory was incredibly short-lived. When I woke up the next morning, the brutal counterattack had already begun. Donovan was absolutely desperate, heavily backed into a terrifying financial corner, and he was completely unwilling to surrender his glamorous lifestyle without launching a massive, vicious fight. He immediately utilized Brielle's immense family wealth and their vast elite public relations connections to launch a highly coordinated, aggressive media smear campaign against me. My phone started vibrating relentlessly on the wooden counter shortly after sunrise. I picked it up and saw dozens of notifications flooding my screen from local Atlanta news outlets, popular social media blogs, and online gossip pages. I opened the first article and felt my blood run completely cold. The headline read, local visionary developer held hostage by bitter ex-wife over technicality. Donovan had hired a ruthless crisis management firm overnight. They had instantly spun a devastating false narrative that painted me as a greedy, vindictive gold digger who was actively trying to extort a highly successful black-owned business out of pure romantic jealousy. The article falsely claimed that I had secretly hidden the water rights documentation during our divorce proceedings, specifically to sabotage his beautiful new relationship with Brielle. They published highly unflattering paparazzi-style photos of me walking out of the courthouse looking entirely broken and disheveled, placing them right next to glamorous professional headshots of Donovan and Brielle. The online comments were absolutely ruthless. Strangers who knew absolutely nothing about my real life or my 8-year marriage were viciously tearing my character apart. They accused me of tearing down a successful black man just because I was bitter that he had finally upgraded to a younger, wealthier woman. They called me incredibly toxic and claimed I was the exact reason why elite men often look outside their own community for peace. Donovan was brilliantly playing the ultimate victim. He was weaponizing the media to publicly shame me into quietly dropping the injunction and signing away my grandfather's land. He wanted to make the intense public pressure so unbearably heavy that I would simply collapse and disappear. I set the phone down on the counter, refusing to read another hateful sentence. I took a deep, steadying breath and walked over to the kitchen sink to wash my face. Just as I turned the cold water off, the loud crunch of expensive tires rolling over gravel broke the quiet morning silence of the woods. I looked out the front window and saw a gleaming silver Mercedes sedan pulling into the muddy driveway. The doors opened and two familiar figures stepped out into the crisp morning air. It was Calvin and Brenda Donovan's wealthy parents. They were dressed impeccably, as they always were, looking completely out of place against the rustic backdrop of the Georgia woods. Brenda wore a pristine beige cashmere sweater, set with heavy gold jewelry, while Calvin sported a tailored golf shirt and expensive slacks. During my entire marriage, they had constantly looked down their noses at me, treating me like a temporary charity project their son had brought home. But today they did not look arrogant. They looked deeply frantic and incredibly desperate. I walked to the front door and opened it, crossing my arms defensively over my chest as they cautiously approached the porch. Charmaine's sweetheart Brenda began, her voice dripping with a sickly, sweet, fake warmth that instantly made my stomach churn. "We are so incredibly glad we found you. We need to talk to you about this terrible misunderstanding with the resort property. Please let us come inside out of the cold." I did not move a single inch. "You can say whatever you need to say right there on the porch," I replied coldly, my voice completely devoid of any welcoming emotion. Brenda sighed heavily, exchanging a tense, nervous glance with her husband. She placed a well-manicured hand over her heart, stepping right into her practiced role of the concerned, loving matriarch. "Charmaine, you have to stop this madness immediately. We are a proud black family. We have to stick together in this harsh world. You are actively tearing down a highly successful black man. Do you have any idea how hard Donovan worked to secure that massive investment from Reginald? You are making our entire community look incredibly bad in front of these wealthy white investors." Calvin quickly chimed in, nodding his head in solemn agreement to reinforce her intense emotional manipulation. He stepped forward, trying to use his deep, authoritative voice to intimidate me into submission. "Brenda is absolutely right. A good, strong woman supports her man even after things come to a difficult end. We understand that you are feeling hurt and acting out of pure bitterness right now, but you are jeopardizing a $100 million project that will bring hundreds of jobs to our people. You are acting incredibly selfish. You need to drop this ridiculous legal injunction today and let my son finish building his legacy." I stared at the two of them, absolutely, completely disgusted by their shameless audacity. They were deliberately using racial guilt and fake community solidarity as a cheap weapon to protect their son's massive, fraudulent crimes. The sheer, blinding hypocrisy of their words ignited a fierce, burning fire deep in my chest. Where exactly was this profound sense of community solidarity? When your son was systematically draining my life savings behind my back? I asked, my voice rising sharply with intense, controlled fury. Where was this beautiful, unbreakable family loyalty when your son forced me out of my own home and left me standing in the freezing rain with $42 to my name? Where were you when your daughter Vanessa laughed in my face and called me a project girl who did not deserve to breathe the same air as your elite family? Brenda flinched visibly, taking a small step backward as my sharp words hit her directly in the face. Charmaine, you are completely misunderstanding the situation, she stammered weakly. We did not know he was going to leave you with absolutely nothing. You knew exactly what he was doing, I snapped viciously, completely cutting off her pathetic, desperate lie. You both knew about his offshore shell accounts. You both knew he was using my software algorithms to build his initial capital. You happily turned a blind eye to his blatant financial abuse because it funded your expensive country club memberships and your luxury European vacations. Do not you ever dare come onto my grandfather's property and try to weaponize our culture to cover up your son's disgusting theft. Donovan is not a visionary leader uplifting the community. He is a pathetic, arrogant thief who built his entire fragile empire on a stolen foundation, and now the absolute total collapse of that empire is solely on his hands. Calvin's face turned a dark, angry shade of purple. He raised his hand and pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. You are going to severely regret this, you ungrateful little brat. When Donovan's lawyers are finished with you, you will not even have this rotting wooden shack left to sleep in. Get off my property right now before I call the county sheriff and have you both officially arrested for trespassing, I commanded sharply, my voice echoing loudly off the surrounding trees. They stared at me for a few tense, terrifying seconds, realizing their cheap emotional manipulation had completely failed to break my resolve. Without uttering another word, Brenda turned around and marched angrily back to the silver Mercedes, her high heels sinking deeply into the soft, wet mud. Calvin followed closely behind her, slamming the heavy car door shut with incredible force. The luxury sedan quickly reversed out of the driveway and sped away down the dirt road, leaving me alone in the absolute silence of the woods. I stood on the porch, taking a deep, ragged breath to calm the fierce adrenaline surging through my veins. I had successfully stood my ground. I had completely rejected their toxic manipulation. For a brief, fleeting moment, I felt an incredible surge of pure, invincible triumph. I turned around to walk back inside the cabin, fully prepared to call Isaiah and plan our next offensive legal strike. But as I reached for the wooden door handle, my cell phone began ringing loudly from the kitchen counter. I walked inside and picked it up. The caller ID displayed Isaiah's secure office number. I answered the call immediately, expecting to hear his usual calm, reassuring tone, congratulating me on the spectacular, successful scene I had caused at the engagement party the night before. Instead, his voice sounded incredibly tight, severely strained, and entirely devoid of its usual steady professional confidence. Charmaine, I need you to listen to me very carefully, Isaiah said urgently, completely skipping our usual polite greetings. Donovan just made a massive, unprecedented legal move. He is completely bypassing the standard environmental courts. What do you mean he is bypassing the courts? I asked, a sudden sharp, cold knot of pure dread instantly forming tight in the very bottom of my stomach. How can he possibly bypass a legally binding state injunction? Because he is not fighting the injunction anymore, Isaiah replied, his heavy breathing entirely audible over the phone line. He just aggressively deployed Brielle's family money to quietly bribe a highly corrupt state senator who sits on the Land Development Committee. They just successfully filed an emergency late-night petition for eminent domain. They are falsely claiming that your complete refusal to release the water rights is actively stalling a major public utility project that is absolutely vital to the economic survival of the county. My mind completely reeled as I desperately tried to process his terrifying words. Eminent domain. The absolute dreaded legal weapon that had historically been used for decades to unjustly strip Black families of their generational wealth and valuable property. The senator just fast-tracked the petition directly to the Supreme State Judge Isaiah, continued, his voice dropping into a grim, serious whisper. If we lose this emergency hearing next week, the government will legally forcefully seize your entire property. They will strip you of your grandfather's water rights, pay you absolute pennies on the dollar, and hand the entire kingdom right back over to Donovan. The phone nearly slipped from my trembling hand. Eminent domain. It was a terrifying concept I had only read about in history books, a brutal mechanism historically weaponized to bulldoze minority neighborhoods and strip black families of generational wealth under the false guise of civic progress. Now Donovan was weaponizing that exact racist framework against me. I asked Isaiah how this was possible when his eco-resort was clearly a private commercial enterprise and not a vital public utility. Isaiah explained that Donovan and his purchased senator had manipulated the legal wording of the emergency petition. They claimed before the Supreme Court that the Oasis Resort would create thousands of permanent local jobs, stimulate the struggling county economy, and generate massive tax revenue for public schools. They successfully argued my vindictive refusal to release the water rights was maliciously stalling a construction project of vital public interest. Because they strategically framed my ownership as an economic emergency, the judge quickly granted them an expedited hearing. We had exactly 5 days. 5 days to build an impenetrable defense, or the state would forcefully condemn my grandfather's property, confiscate the water rights, and hand them back over to Donovan for a fraction of their market value. I hung up feeling completely suffocated. The dark wooden walls of the small cabin seemed to close in tightly around me. Donovan had limitless financial resources from his billionaire future father-in-law, an army of ruthless corporate attorneys who billed thousands of dollars an hour, and corrupt local politicians safely tucked inside his pockets. I had an old, dusty cabin and a bank vault full of 40-year-old paper. If we walked into that courtroom next week relying solely on my basic legal right to hold property, the judge would completely crush me. We desperately needed a silver bullet. We needed irrefutable documented proof that Donovan's entire resort project was profoundly corrupt. I called Isaiah right back and told him to cancel all his appointments and drive out to the cabin immediately. Grandpa Elijah was an incredibly meticulous, calculating man. If he had spent years tracking Donovan's financial crimes and building this elaborate trap, he would never have left me exposed to a predictable legal loophole like eminent domain. He had to have hidden more evidence. Isaiah arrived 2 hours later, completely trading his tailored navy suit for worn jeans and a thick woolen sweater. He walked through the front door carrying 2 high-powered flashlights, a heavy iron crowbar, and heavy-duty trash bags. We did not waste a single second exchanging polite pleasantries. We immediately went to grueling work. We started in the main living area, pulling up loose floorboards, checking behind crumbling drywall, and emptying dusty kitchen cabinets. We found absolutely nothing but mouse droppings, dead insects, and ancient dirt. By late afternoon, we turned our desperate attention to the absolute only place left in the cabin we had not fully explored: the basement. I had always hated the basement as a child. It was a dark, damp, subterranean cellar accessible only through a heavy wooden trapdoor hidden in the hallway floor. Isaiah wedged the sharp end of the crowbar under the rusted iron ring and pulled the heavy trapdoor open with a loud, agonizing creak. A wave of freezing cold, musty air rushed up to greet us. We slowly descended the rickety wooden stairs, our bright flashlight beams piercing the pitch-black darkness. The basement was essentially a massive, chaotic storage unit for decades of Grandpa Elijah's forgotten life. It was filled from concrete floor to low wooden ceiling with towering, unstable stacks of damp cardboard boxes, rusted car parts, broken lawnmowers, and shattered furniture. The massive volume of junk was overwhelming. Finding a single important piece of paper down here felt entirely impossible. But the loud ticking clock of the strict 5-day deadline echoed violently in my head, fueling my frantic energy. We systematically began tearing the basement apart. I aggressively ripped open damp boxes, my fingers quickly becoming covered in thick black grime and spider webs. We frantically sifted through thousands of yellowed grocery receipts, ancient tax returns, and greasy automotive repair manuals. Every single time my dirty fingers brushed against a thick folder, my heart would leap with wild, desperate hope, only to crash violently when I realized it was just an expired warranty or a meaningless hardware store flyer. The long hours bled painfully into each other. The freezing cold dampness of the dark cellar seeped deeply into my tired bones. My back ached with the exact same fierce burning intensity as my first day cleaning the cabin. I refused to stop. Isaiah worked right alongside me, coughing quietly through the choking dust, using his sharp, experienced legal mind to quickly scan and discard massive piles of useless old documents. By the late evening of the third agonizing day, our dire situation felt incredibly bleak. We had successfully cleared almost half of the massive basement, filling dozens of black trash bags, but we were absolutely empty-handed. We had only 48 hours left before the brutal eminent domain hearing. The crushing weight of impending total defeat began to fully settle over my tired shoulders. I sat down heavily on a broken wooden crate, wiping a thick mixture of cold sweat and black dirt from my forehead. I looked over at Isaiah, who was leaning heavily against a cracked concrete support pillar, looking just as exhausted and utterly defeated as I felt. Donovan was actually going to completely win. He was going to successfully steal my grandfather's legacy, build his glittering luxury resort, and legally validate every single cruel, insulting thing his arrogant family had ever said about me. The bad guys were actually going to win simply because they had enough money to buy the legal system and rewrite the rules of justice. I buried my filthy face in my shaking hands, fiercely fighting back hot tears of intense, bitter frustration. I took a deep, ragged breath and looked around the dim, messy cellar one last time. My bright flashlight beams slowly swept across the far back dark corner of the room, illuminating a small wooden workbench that was partially hidden behind a broken iron water heater. Underneath that dusty workbench, covered by a thick, heavy canvas tarp, was a large, rusty red metal toolbox. It was the exact same toolbox Grandpa Elijah used to carry around when he patiently taught. He taught me how to fix broken plumbing when I was a teenager. I slowly stood up, my aching muscles, groaning loudly in severe protest, and walked over to the dark corner. I grabbed the frayed edge of the filthy canvas tarp and forcefully pulled it away. A massive, thick cloud of gray dust plumed wildly into the freezing air. The heavy metal toolbox was secured tight with a thick, solid brass padlock. It was the absolute only item in the entire massive basement that was intentionally securely locked. I called out loudly to Isaiah, my dry voice cracking slightly with a sudden renewed surge of urgent hope. He hurried over immediately, his tired eyes widening as he saw the heavy, shiny brass lock. He handed me the iron crowbar without saying a word. I wedged the sharp flat end directly into the thick metal hasp. I threw my entire body weight aggressively against the iron bar, grunting loudly with intense physical effort. The old rusted metal violently groaned and suddenly snapped with a loud, deafening crack. The broken brass padlock hit the solid concrete floor heavily. I dropped the iron crowbar and reached out with violently shaking hands. I slowly lifted the heavy red metal lid of the toolbox. Inside, there were absolutely no greasy wrenches, heavy hammers, or rusted screwdrivers. The entire deep metal box was completely filled with perfectly organized, thick manila folders. They were incredibly well preserved, completely free from the destructive dampness of the surrounding dark cellar. I pulled out the very first thick folder and flipped it open under the bright, harsh beam of my flashlight. My breath caught violently in my dry throat. I stared intensely at the crisp white pages, unable to process the complex numbers printed in bold black ink. They were highly detailed, official bank statements and quarterly investment portfolio reports, but they were absolutely not from First Sovereign Bank or any local branch. They were from massive international offshore accounts, elite private equity firms, and incredibly exclusive hedge funds. The official dates, clearly printed on the top corners of the pages, went back exactly 15 years. The account balances listed at the absolute bottom of every single page were completely staggering. We were not looking at thousands of dollars or even a few million. We were looking at tens of millions of dollars, in highly liquid diversified assets. I quickly grabbed another thick folder, my hands trembling so violently I almost dropped the precious papers onto the dirty concrete floor. I opened it and found official corporate registration documents. Grandpa Elijah was not just hoarding land, he was an anonymous high-stakes private investor and the absolute majority shareholder of a shadow private equity firm known in the elite financial underground as Blackwood Capital. I stared at the bold, embossed logo on the heavy corporate letterhead, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the sudden discovery. Grandpa Elijah had intentionally cultivated the harmless, humble persona of a quiet, retired mechanic living in a crumbling rural cabin. He drove a beat-up pickup truck and wore faded flannel shirts. But behind that brilliant, meticulously crafted disguise, he was ruthlessly orchestrating high-yield corporate acquisitions, massive leveraged buyouts, and incredibly lucrative debt restructuring deals across the entire eastern seaboard. Isaiah grabbed a stack of the financial reports from my trembling hands. His eyes darted rapidly across the dense columns of numbers and complex legal corporate structures. His jaw literally dropped open. I have been practicing corporate law in the state of Georgia for almost 30 years, Isaiah whispered, his deep voice echoing loudly in the damp, freezing basement. Blackwood Capital is an absolute legend in the commercial real estate sector. They are known as a hyper-aggressive ghost firm. They provide massive short-term bridge loans to desperate corporate developers who cannot secure traditional bank funding. Their interest rates are notoriously predatory, and their collateral demands are absolutely merciless. Nobody in the financial district actually knows who sits on their executive board. It is completely shielded by multiple layers of anonymous offshore trusts. He looked up from the aged papers and stared directly into my eyes, his face completely pale with profound shock. Your grandfather was the phantom executive chairman of Blackwood Capital. He was the invisible hand, silently funding and foreclosing on half the commercial skyline of downtown Atlanta. We did not waste another single second in that freezing cellar. The crushing, heavy exhaustion that had paralyzed my body just 10 minutes ago was entirely erased by a massive surging wave of pure electric adrenaline. We carefully packed the precious thick folders back into the rusty red toolbox and carried it heavily up the creaking wooden stairs to the main living area. I immediately locked the heavy front door of the cabin and pulled all the dusty window curtains tightly shut. I sparked a bright hot fire in the old stone fireplace to warm the freezing room, while Isaiah quickly booted up his secure encrypted legal laptop on the scratched kitchen counter. We needed to rapidly cross-reference the massive liquid assets held within Blackwood Capital against the current terrifying legal crisis Donovan had just successfully engineered. I poured us both a steaming cup of strong black coffee from the small metal camping stove, my analytical mind racing with 1,000 complex strategic possibilities. We have the endless financial resources to fight the eminent domain petition now, I said, pacing rapidly across the clean wooden floorboards. We can hire the absolute best corporate defense attorneys in the entire country. We can completely bury Donovan and that corrupt state senator in endless expensive federal appeals until his billionaire investors completely pull out of the eco-resort project. Isaiah typed furiously on his black keyboard, his silver-framed glasses reflecting the bright blue light of the computer monitor. We could definitely do that, he agreed, his eyes entirely locked on the rapid scrolling text of the state commercial registry database. But that would require years of grueling, exhausting public litigation. Donovan is currently fighting like a deeply wounded, cornered animal. We need to figure out exactly how he managed to secure the massive amount of liquid cash required to aggressively bribe a sitting state senator literally overnight. After the spectacular, devastating scene you caused at the engagement party, Reginald immediately froze all the incoming construction capital for the Oasis Resort. I verified it directly through my private banking contacts yesterday morning. Donovan's primary development firm was entirely cut off from all traditional financial lifelines. He tapped the enter key with a loud, sharp click. The screen instantly filled with a complex, tangled web of recent corporate filings, municipal tax records, and high-level commercial banking transfers. Isaiah leaned much closer to the screen, his dark eyes narrowing with intense, sharp focus. When a major real estate developer suddenly loses his primary financial backer right in the middle of a massive multi-million-dollar construction project, he cannot simply walk into a local bank and politely ask for a personal commercial loan. The standard underwriting process takes several agonizing months. Donovan needed millions of dollars in untraceable liquid cash within 48 hours to pay off that corrupt politician and aggressively force the eminent domain petition through the Supreme Court docket. I stopped my frantic pacing and stood directly behind Isaiah, looking over his broad shoulder at the glowing screen. Where exactly did he get the money to pay the bribe? I asked, feeling a sharp, cold knot of tension tightening rapidly in my chest. Isaiah opened a freshly registered Uniform Commercial Code filing from the County Clerk Public Database. He got it from the absolute only place that provides massive unregulated immediate cash to desperate failing developers. Isaiah replied, a slow, dark, dangerous smile beginning to form on his face. He went to a hard money private equity lender. He took out an incredibly toxic high-interest predatory bridge loan. Isaiah highlighted a specific dense block of legal text on the bright screen. According to this official public filing, Donovan successfully secured a $5 million emergency cash injection just 2 days ago. But because his primary firm was rapidly bleeding money and his wealthy investors had completely abandoned him, the private equity lender demanded absolute total commercial collateral. Donovan legally pledged 100% of his corporate assets to strictly secure this loan. He put up the property deeds to his luxury midtown penthouse. He put up his expensive imported sports cars. He put up his entire personal financial investment portfolio. And most importantly, he put up the entire controlling ownership stake of his real estate development firm as direct unmitigated collateral. I stared blankly at the screen, my mind quickly digesting the severe, catastrophic risk my ex-husband had just blindly taken. If he defaults on this specific loan, the private lender does not even have to take him to civil court for a lengthy, drawn-out trial. I observed carefully, reading the strict, harsh covenants of the legal agreement. They can simply execute the collateral clause and legally seize his entire life overnight. Exactly, Isaiah confirmed, his deep voice vibrating with barely contained righteous triumph. Predatory commercial loans like this specific one are brilliantly designed to trap arrogant, desperate men. They contain incredibly strict behavioral covenants. If the borrower misses a single solitary payment, or if they violate any of the rigid legal conditions explicitly outlined in the master contract, the loan is immediately placed into unrecoverable default. Isaiah scrolled quickly down to the final page of the loan agreement, highlighting a dense, thick paragraph buried deeply in the fine print. Look at Clause Section 4, Paragraph B, he instructed, pointing his silver pen directly at the screen. The borrower is strictly prohibited from initiating any new active litigation involving state or federal government entities without the prior written legal consent of the lender. This is a standard aggressive protective clause to ensure the collateral is not tied up in messy, endless government lawsuits. My breath caught sharply in my dry throat. Donovan just filed an emergency petition for eminent domain against me. I whispered, the massive realization hitting me like a physical heavy blow. He just intentionally initiated a massive aggressive government lawsuit to steal my grandfather's land, which means he just officially violated the core binding covenant of his massive bridge loan, Isaiah stated clearly, turning his leather chair around to look directly at me. He is currently in absolute, total default. The lender has the immediate legal right to foreclose on his company, seize his penthouse, and completely liquidate his entire corporate existence to rapidly recover their capital. I looked slowly away from the computer screen and stared down at the rusty red metal toolbox sitting quietly on the kitchen counter. A profound, deafening, heavy silence fell over the small cabin. The scattered pieces of my grandfather's absolute genius puzzle finally locked firmly together with terrifying, flawless precision. Grandpa Elijah had not just accurately anticipated the divorce. He had perfectly predicted Donovan's immense greed, his profound blinding arrogance, and his ultimate desperate panicked downfall. He knew that when Donovan was finally backed into an inescapable financial corner, he would bypass the traditional banks and run straight into the open arms of the predatory underground lenders. I slowly reached into the old toolbox and pulled out the thick master corporate ledger for Blackwood Capital. I flipped rapidly to the very last page, scanning the massive printed list of active commercial loans currently held by the private equity firm. My index finger traced down the long, dense column of names and corporate entities until it stopped dead on a completely fresh entry dated just 2 days ago. The borrower legally listed was Apex Holdings, Donovan's primary development firm. The loan amount was exactly $5 million. The official lender of record was Blackwood Capital. A low, genuine laugh escaped my lips. It started as a soft, quiet chuckle and quickly grew into a full, loud expression of pure, victorious, absolute disbelief. The sheer, beautiful, poetic irony of the entire situation was almost entirely incomprehensible. Donovan had viciously stolen my life savings to illegally build his fragile corporate empire. He had cruelly thrown me out into the freezing rain with $42 and two cheap, scuffed suitcases. He had bribed a corrupt state senator to forcefully steal my grandfather's legacy. And to completely fund that massive illegal theft, he had secretly mortgaged his entire life to a faceless shadow corporation. He had absolutely no idea who he was actually dealing with. He truly thought he was brilliantly outsmarting me. He thought he was using his elite societal connections to completely crush the poor working-class girl he had foolishly married. I looked up at Isaiah, my eyes burning fiercely with a cold, indestructible, ancient power. I do not just hold the subterranean water rights to his $100 million resort. I said, my voice completely steady and ringing with absolute terrifying finality. Through my grandfather's private trust, I am the executive chairman of Blackwood Capital. I am the exact lender who quietly gave him the $5 million to bribe the state senator. I am Donovan's biggest corporate creditor. I literally own the massive, crushing legal debt on his entire miserable life. Isaiah closed the secure, encrypted laptop with a solid, satisfying, sharp click. We do not need to spend 5 agonizing days frantically building a weak, desperate defense against an eminent domain petition, Isaiah said, a brilliant, dangerous, authentic smile fully spreading across his weathered face. We just need to proudly show up to the Supreme Court hearing on Friday morning and officially foreclose on the arrogant plaintiff. I picked up the heavy corporate ledger and clutched it tightly against my chest. Donovan desperately wanted a ruthless, brutal war. He wanted to maliciously use the legal system to utterly, completely destroy me. But he was about to learn the absolute hardest, most devastating lesson of his entire existence. You can never successfully bury a woman who completely, officially owns the very ground you are arrogantly standing on. I looked out the dusty cabin window into the dark, freezing Georgia woods, fully prepared to walk into that massive, towering courtroom and execute the final, flawless destruction of my ex-husband. Friday morning arrived with a cold, biting wind that swept sharply through the tall concrete canyons of downtown Atlanta. I stood at the bottom of the wide, polished marble steps of the state Supreme Courthouse, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal gray power suit. Isaiah stood right beside me, holding a thick black leather briefcase that contained the absolute total destruction of the man waiting inside. The heavy glass doors of the massive courthouse were heavily swarmed by local news crews, aggressive freelance reporters, and flashing camera lenses. Donovan and his elite public relations team had intentionally tipped off the local press, hoping to use the heavy media presence to publicly humiliate me one final time. They wanted the entire city to witness my crushing, absolute defeat. We pushed our way firmly through the dense, chaotic crowd, completely ignoring the loudly shouted questions and the bright, blinding camera flashes. We walked straight into the massive, towering courtroom. The sheer architectural scale of the room was deliberately designed to intimidate, with massive, dark, oak-paneled walls and a high, vaulted ceiling that echoed every single footstep. The gallery benches were completely packed to maximum capacity, with curious spectators, wealthy city officials, and eager journalists ready to write the sensational headline of my pathetic downfall. I looked directly toward the plaintiff table near the front. Donovan was sitting there leaning casually back in his heavy wooden chair. He was wearing a custom navy blue designer suit, looking incredibly relaxed and sickeningly triumphant. Brielle was sitting directly behind him in the very first row of the gallery, dressed in a bright pink tweed suit that looked completely inappropriate for a serious legal proceeding. Vanessa sat right next to Brielle, whispering excitedly behind her manicured hand and shooting me incredibly nasty, venomous glares. They were completely surrounded by a massive team of high-priced corporate lawyers. Donovan leaned over and whispered something to his lead attorney, and they both broke into a quiet, arrogant chuckle. They genuinely believed they had already secured the absolute victory. They had paid the massive illegal bribe. They had successfully bought the highly corrupt state senator. They assumed the judge presiding over this emergency hearing was already perfectly aligned with their aggressive political agenda. They looked at me as if I was a foolish little bug that was about to be effortlessly crushed under their expensive polished shoes. I pulled out my chair at the defense table and sat down, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely unreadable. The heavy wooden door right behind the elevated bench suddenly swung open, and the armed bailiff loudly ordered the entire crowded courtroom to rise. The Supreme Court judge took his seat. He was a stern older man, with a heavily lined face and a remarkably impatient, arrogant demeanor. He aggressively adjusted his reading glasses and immediately called the highly anticipated session to order. Donovan's lead corporate attorney stood up immediately. He was a tall, imposing man with a slick, aggressive courtroom presence. He quickly buttoned his expensive suit jacket and walked confidently toward the center wooden podium. For the next 30 agonizing minutes, he delivered a masterfully manipulative, highly theatrical speech. He did not speak a single word about stolen marital assets or fraudulent prenuptial agreements. He spoke entirely about civic duty, massive economic progress, and the vital future survival of the struggling county. He gestured dramatically toward the large, colorful architectural renderings of the Oasis Resort displayed on heavy easels near the jury box. He passionately described the thousands of permanent local jobs the luxury eco-resort would supposedly create for struggling working-class families. He talked endlessly about the massive influx of crucial tax revenue that would single-handedly rescue the failing local public school system. He painted a beautiful, perfect picture of a thriving, wealthy community that was only being held back by one single terrible problem. And then he viciously turned his aggressive attack directly onto me. He pointed a sharp, accusing finger directly at the defense table where Isaiah and I sat in total silence. He aggressively painted me as a deeply bitter, incredibly greedy ex-wife who was intentionally holding an entire county hostage out of pure malicious romantic spite. He falsely claimed to the court that I had absolutely no intention of ever developing the 500 acres of barren woodland. He mocked my grandfather's rustic cabin, calling it a dangerous, abandoned eyesore. He told the corrupt judge that I was weaponizing an archaic, outdated state water rights law simply to extort his visionary young client for millions of dollars. He urged the court to swiftly execute the absolute powers of eminent domain to instantly remove this incredibly toxic, selfish obstacle from the path of undeniable public progress. It was an incredibly convincing, highly polished performance. If I had not known the absolute terrifying truth about Donovan's massive predatory debt, I might have actually felt entirely crushed by the sheer heavy weight of his fabricated legal narrative. The judge nodded slowly and sympathetically throughout the entire dramatic speech, taking occasional notes and casting incredibly stern, disapproving glances in my specific direction. The heavy judicial bias in the courtroom was absolutely undeniable. The judge had clearly already made up his mind before I even walked through the heavy wooden doors. When the aggressive corporate lawyer finally concluded his grand, sweeping speech and confidently took his seat, a low murmur of absolute agreement rippled rapidly through the packed gallery. Brielle clapped her hands together, softly beaming with pure arrogant pride as she looked at Donovan's broad shoulders. Donovan shot me a quick, deadly smirk across the aisle, clearly expecting me to dissolve into a puddle of desperate, helpless tears right then and there. The judge banged his heavy wooden gavel once to restore total silence in the room. He looked down at me from his high elevated bench, his expression completely devoid of any basic judicial neutrality. He let out a long, heavy, incredibly condescending sigh. Miss Charmaine, the judge, began, his deep, authoritative voice echoing harshly across the silent room. The plaintiff has presented a highly compelling, urgent argument for the immediate legal execution of eminent domain regarding the subterranean rights currently held by your corporate trust. This state court is generally highly reluctant to strip private property owners of their legal rights, but the overwhelming economic public interest in this specific luxury development project simply cannot be easily ignored. The judge folded his hands tightly on the bench and leaned forward aggressively, glaring down at me over his glasses. Do you or your legal counsel have any substantive legal defense to offer today, or are you simply going to waste any more of this court's valuable time fighting an inevitable legal conclusion? The entire packed courtroom held its collective breath. Dozens of reporters leaned forward eagerly in the hard wooden pews, their pens hovering rapidly over their notepads. They fully expected me to launch into a desperate, highly emotional plea. They expected me to scream about the brutal unfairness of the divorce, or to pathetically beg the corrupt judge to protect my late grandfather's historical legacy. From the corner of my eye, I saw Vanessa pull out her expensive smartphone, attempting to discreetly record my final embarrassing humiliation from the gallery. I remained completely seated for a few long, tense seconds, deliberately, letting the incredibly heavy silence stretch out until it became physically uncomfortable for everyone in the room. I looked over at Isaiah. He did not look worried. He looked absolutely incredibly serene. He gave me a single tiny confirming nod. I slowly pushed my heavy wooden chair back. The legs scraped loudly across the polished floor. I stood up perfectly straight, smoothly adjusting the front of my charcoal gray suit jacket. I did not look angry. I did not look defeated. I looked entirely profoundly bored. I took one slow, confident step away from the defense table and looked directly up at the impatient judge. Your Honor, I began, my voice ringing out crystal clear and completely steady in the massive silent room. I have listened very carefully to the passionate, brilliant economic arguments presented by the plaintiff's legal counsel today, and after deep, careful consideration regarding the future prosperity of this county, I must admit that they make an absolutely excellent point. A sudden wave of extreme confusion washed rapidly over the courtroom. The lead corporate attorney furrowed his brow, leaning over to whisper frantically to Donovan. The judge looked incredibly startled, his stern face relaxing into a look of pure bewilderment. I took another step forward, keeping my posture completely flawless. I have absolutely no desire to stand in the way of undeniable public progress. I continued smoothly, my voice projecting effortlessly to the very back row of the packed gallery. I do not want to be a greedy, selfish obstacle. I do not want to hold the local economy hostage. Therefore, Your Honor, I completely yield. The sudden collective gasp from the gallery was incredibly loud. Flashbulbs went off wildly near the heavy wooden doors as eager reporters scrambled to capture the shocking, unexpected moment. I did not break my intense eye contact with the confused judge. I am completely, perfectly willing to voluntarily surrender the absolute water rights of E and C Holdings directly to Donovan's primary development firm, right here and right now. I do not want millions of dollars. I will officially sign the master transfer deed over to his company for exactly $1. For 3 long seconds, the massive courtroom was plunged into a state of absolute stunned paralysis. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The corrupt judge stared at me with his mouth slightly hanging open, entirely unable to process the sheer, unprecedented magnitude of my sudden total surrender. And then the heavy, tense silence was violently shattered by a loud, booming laugh. It was Donovan. He threw his head back and laughed out loud, a cruel, harsh, deeply arrogant sound that echoed triumphantly off the high, vaulted ceiling. He slammed his hand down hard on the plaintiff table, genuinely believing he had completely broken my spirit. He thought his vicious smear campaign, his fake tax liens, and his corrupt legal maneuvering had successfully terrified me into a total pathetic submission. He laughed because he thought he had finally won the ultimate war. He had absolutely no idea that I had just quietly locked the heavy iron door of his execution chamber. Donovan finally managed to catch his breath, wiping a theatrical tear of pure amusement from the corner of his eye. He looked up at the corrupt judge and nodded eagerly. "You heard her. Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with unbearable arrogance. "The defense yields. Let the court record officially state that my development firm accepts this incredibly generous transfer of the water rights for the agreed-upon sum of exactly $1. The judge aggressively banged his heavy wooden gavel, a wide, satisfied smile, completely breaking through his previously stern, judicial facade. He instructed the court clerk to immediately draft the expedited transfer agreement. The clerk rapidly typed the official binding order, printed a single crisp page, and handed it directly to the bailiff. The bailiff walked the document over to the plaintiff table and placed it right in front of Donovan. Donovan eagerly reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. He clicked the pen with a sharp metallic snap that echoed loudly in the silent, anticipating courtroom. He looked across the aisle at me, his eyes practically glowing with intense, malicious triumph, and lowered the gold pen toward the signature line. I did not panic. I simply looked over at Isaiah and gave him a single sharp nod. Isaiah immediately unlatched his thick black leather briefcase. He reached inside and pulled out a massive heavy binder, deeply embossed with a bright red legal stamp. He handed it to me. I stepped away from the defense table and walked directly toward the center podium. "Wait just a moment, Your Honor," I announced, my voice cutting through the heavy silence like a sharp steel blade. Donovan froze completely, the gold tip of his expensive pen hovering just a fraction of an inch above the white paper. I said I was perfectly willing to sign over the water rights to his company. However, by legally initiating this emergency state lawsuit today, the plaintiff has just severely violated the strict non-litigation clause of his current commercial financing. Therefore, he actually no longer has a company for me to sign those rights over to. The judge slammed his hand down on the elevated bench, clearly enraged by my sudden dramatic interruption. "What kind of ridiculous nonsense is this, Miss Charmaine?" he barked aggressively. "You just explicitly yielded your position on the public record. You cannot suddenly change your mind and invent imaginary financial violations to delay this official proceeding." I did not flinch at his loud judicial reprimand. I simply opened the massive red-stamped binder and pulled out the thick master loan agreement we had recovered from my grandfather's hidden basement toolbox. "I am not inventing anything, Your Honor," I replied calmly. 2 days ago, Donovan secured a $5 million high-interest commercial bridge loan to aggressively fund the massive sudden legal expenses of this exact eminent domain petition. The strict binding covenants of that specific predatory loan explicitly prohibit the borrower from initiating any new active litigation involving government entities without prior written consent. By standing in this courtroom today and filing this emergency state petition against me, Donovan has officially triggered an unrecoverable catastrophic default on his entire corporate financing. Donovan scoffed loudly, standing up from his chair. "This is an absolute pathetic joke," he yelled across the room. "My private commercial loans have absolutely nothing to do with this state land dispute. You are just a bitter, desperate woman grasping at invisible straws." I turned my head slowly and looked him directly in the eyes. "The private lender on your master contract is a shadow equity firm known as Blackwood Capital," I stated clearly. "Is that correct, Donovan?" The color instantly completely drained from his handsome face. His confident, arrogant posture immediately collapsed. He stared at me in pure, silent horror, completely unable to comprehend how a supposedly poor, working-class woman from the suburbs knew the highly classified name of his secret underground lender. The corrupt judge leaned forward, his judicial bias momentarily replaced by genuine legal curiosity. He ordered the bailiff to approach the podium and retrieve the documents from my hand. The bailiff handed the thick red stamped binder up to the elevated bench. The judge aggressively flipped through the crisp pages, his eyes rapidly scanning the complex official financial signatures, the massive corporate collateral agreements, and the strict non-litigation clauses. The judge looked up, his expression deeply troubled. These financial documents appear to be entirely authentic and legally binding. The judge admitted slowly, his voice losing all of its previous arrogant bite. But the plaintiff is technically correct. The internal commercial violations of his private equity loan with Blackwood Capital are entirely irrelevant to this specific state property hearing. You have absolutely no legal standing to suddenly enforce a third-party financial contract in this specific courtroom. I smiled. It was the exact same slow, devastating smile Grandpa Elijah used to give me when he was about to completely win a game of chess. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored charcoal jacket and pulled out the final master executive document Isaiah had drafted just hours before the hearing. I have absolute supreme legal standing, Your Honor, I declared, my voice echoing with terrifying, undeniable power across the massive room. I am not a third party. As the sole legal heir of Elijah's private trust, I am the active executive chairman and majority shareholder of Blackwood Capital. The sheer explosive magnitude of my words hit the entire courtroom like a massive physical shockwave. A loud collective gasp violently erupted from the packed gallery behind me. Reporters instantly jumped to their feet, frantically scribbling notes and rapidly whispering into their digital recorders. The heavy camera shutters clicked wildly in a deafening, chaotic frenzy. I ignored the absolute chaos erupting behind me and kept my piercing gaze entirely locked on Donovan. His jaw was hanging completely open. His eyes were wide with a deeply primal, absolute terror. He was finally completely understanding the massive, inescapable trap he had just blindly walked into. I am officially calling in his defaulted loan. I continued, speaking clearly over the rising chaotic noise of the shocked gallery. I do not need to keep my water rights, Your Honor, because as of exactly 60 seconds ago, my private equity firm legally executed the master collateral clause. We just officially foreclosed on his entire corporate existence. I now own the Oasis Luxury Resort project. I own his primary real estate development firm. I own his expensive imported sports cars. And I own the massive midtown penthouse he currently sleeps in. Donovan dropped his heavy gold fountain pen. It hit the polished wooden table with a sharp, pathetic clatter and rolled slowly onto the floor. No, he whispered, his voice cracking violently in a pathetic, helpless wheeze. No, that is completely impossible. You are lying. You do not have that kind of money. You are just a broke hair braider. I took one final triumphant step toward his table. I was broke because you systematically stole my life savings, Donovan, I replied, my voice dripping with cold, absolute justice. But my grandfather was silently buying the earth beneath your feet for 40 years. You thought you were incredibly brilliant by secretly taking out a massive predatory loan to bribe a politician and steal my land. But you were just arrogant enough to put your entire miserable life up as collateral without ever checking exactly who held the actual debt. You literally mortgaged your entire empire directly to your ex-wife. The courtroom instantly completely erupted into pure, unadulterated chaos. The judge aggressively pounded his heavy wooden gavel again and again, desperately shouting for order, but nobody in the massive room was paying any attention to him anymore. The devastating reality of the brutal financial execution had finally fully set in. In the very front row of the gallery, Brielle suddenly stood up. Her face was flushed dark red with extreme sheer humiliation and total, absolute rage. She realized in a single terrifying instant that the handsome, wealthy visionary developer she was about to marry was actually a completely bankrupt fraud who had just lost her billionaire father's entire massive investment. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at Donovan. "You pathetic, lying, absolute loser!" she screamed at the top of her lungs, completely abandoning her polished high society persona. "My father is going to absolutely, completely destroy whatever is left of you." She angrily ripped the massive, sparkling diamond engagement ring off her finger and forcefully threw it directly at his face. The heavy, expensive ring bounced sharply off his tailored shoulder and vanished under the heavy wooden tables. Brielle grabbed her expensive designer purse and stormed furiously out of the chaotic courtroom, violently pushing past the crowding, aggressive reporters. Directly behind her, sitting completely paralyzed in the wooden pew, was Vanessa. The deeply arrogant sister who had mocked my cheap suitcases in the freezing rain and called me a project girl was currently hyperventilating. She realized that the luxury company cars, the massive family trust funds, and the elite country club memberships funded by Donovan's firm were all instantly completely gone. Vanessa buried her face in her trembling hands and burst into loud, pathetic, ugly tears, her pristine elite world totally, utterly shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. Near the heavy oak side doors of the courtroom, the corrupt state senator who had illegally fast-tracked the eminent domain petitions suddenly realized he was completely exposed. He saw the aggressive reporters rapidly turning their flashing cameras toward the massive financial scandal unfolding on the official legal record. He quietly pulled his suit collar up high around his neck, quickly pushed the heavy side door open, and slipped silently out into the back hallway like a terrified, fleeing rat. But the absolute most satisfying, devastating reaction belonged entirely to Donovan. The charming, arrogant fraternity brother facade completely violently disintegrated. His legs simply stopped supporting his heavy body weight. He slowly sank down beside the plaintiff table. He dropped entirely to his knees right there on the hard, polished floor of the state Supreme Court. He grabbed fistfuls of his perfectly styled, expensive hair, staring blankly at the torn pieces of his completely ruined, fraudulent life. He had nothing left. No company, no fiancé, no penthouse, no money. He was instantly reduced to absolute total nothingness by the very same woman he had confidently told to take her trash and go. I stood incredibly tall in the absolute center of the massive, chaotic room. The heavy, aggressive camera flashes illuminated the complete destruction of my enemies. I did not smile. I did not gloat or scream in victorious triumph. I just buttoned my tailored charcoal jacket, picked up the massive red-stamped binder, and turned my back on the pathetic, ruined man weeping loudly on the floor. I walked calmly down the center aisle of the courtroom with Isaiah right by my side, parting the massive sea of shocked reporters and wealthy elite spectators, like absolute royalty claiming her rightful throne. The heavy oak doors of the Supreme Court closed firmly behind Isaiah and me, instantly shutting out the chaotic circus of reporters and the pathetic sobbing of a completely broken man. Stepping out into the crisp Atlanta afternoon, the cold, biting wind from earlier had completely vanished, replaced by a warm, golden sunlight that felt like a profound blessing. There were no dramatic screaming matches in the parking lot. There was no physical hair-pulling or reality television-style brawling. My revenge was not delivered through loud, emotional outbursts. It was delivered through the cold, hard, undeniable justice of legally executed paperwork. Over the next 48 hours, the massive corporate guillotine fell with absolute terrifying efficiency. Isaiah unleashed an army of elite forensic accountants and ruthless corporate liquidators to immediately secure every single asset legally tied to Donovan's defaulted loan. The swiftness of his total destruction was almost breathtaking to witness from a safe distance. Reginald Brielle's billionaire father did exactly what any ruthless veteran investor would do when faced with a catastrophic financial liability. He aggressively severed all personal and professional ties. Reginald immediately dispatched his own legal team to officially cancel the extravagant engagement and the upcoming wedding, leaving Donovan entirely responsible for the massive non-refundable vendor deposits. But Reginald did not simply stop at canceling the wedding. He filed a massive civil lawsuit against Donovan for gross financial misrepresentation and blatant fraud. Because Donovan had foolishly used his own personal assets as collateral for the Blackwood Capital loan, the corporate shield of his primary development firm was completely pierced. He was held personally liable for millions of dollars in outstanding debts, severe legal penalties, and broken commercial contracts. He was evicted from the luxurious Midtown penthouse before the weekend was even over, escorted out of the lobby by armed security guards, with nothing but a few cardboard boxes of his clothes. He was completely stripped of his pristine credit score, his elite professional reputation, and his entire arrogant identity. The devastating ripple effects of his massive financial collapse rapidly spread to the rest of his incredibly toxic family. For years, Vanessa and her parents had gleefully funded their lavish elite lifestyles directly through the corporate accounts of Donovan's primary development firm. They had used the company credit cards to buy designer handbags, expensive country club memberships, and luxury European vacations. When Blackwood Capital officially seized the company, all of those elite corporate perks were instantly violently terminated. I will never forget the immense, profound satisfaction of driving past Donovan's old corporate office building a week later and witnessing the sheer poetic justice unfolding right in the front parking lot. A heavy-duty tow truck was actively repossessing Vanessa's pristine white luxury company car. She stood on the wet sidewalk screaming frantically at the tow truck driver while desperately clutching her expensive leather handbag. But screaming at working-class people does not stop illegal bank repossession. I watched through the tinted window of my town car as Vanessa, the very same arrogant woman who had maliciously thrown my cheap suitcases onto the wet pavement and told me to take my trash and go, was forced to slowly walk down the street and wait at a public city bus stop in the light drizzling rain. The incredible poetic symmetry of the universe had perfectly balanced the scales. Donovan's parents faced an equally humiliating social downfall. Their elite friends at the country club immediately abandoned them the second the massive scandal hit the local financial newspapers. They were rapidly completely ostracized from the high society circles they had valued over basic human decency. We flash forward exactly 6 months later. The bitter, freezing cold of that dark, terrible winter has completely melted away, giving birth to a bright, vibrant, and incredibly prosperous summer. I am standing on the sprawling upper balcony of a massive, beautiful architectural masterpiece. The warm Georgia breeze gently rustles the leaves of the old oak trees surrounding the property. I look down at the bustling, vibrant activity happening on the ground level. The massive project that Donovan had arrogantly tried to build on stolen foundations is finally officially complete. But it looks absolutely nothing like the exclusive, pretentious playground he had originally envisioned for his wealthy, elite friends. When I took full legal control of the massive development project, I completely fired every single corrupt contractor and arrogant executive Donovan had hired. I brought in Isaiah as my chief legal counsel and completely restructured the entire commercial vision from the ground up. I looked proudly at the massive, beautiful stone entrance gates at the very front of the sprawling property. The old flashy metallic sign that proudly read "The Oasis" has been completely, permanently removed. In its place stands a magnificent hand-carved wooden sign crafted from massive local oak. The bold, elegant letters proudly declare the new name of the property: Elijah's Heritage Resort. I intentionally transformed the entire massive property into a thriving, beautiful community-focused luxury destination. I refused to let my grandfather's precious land become a walled-off fortress for corrupt billionaires. Instead, Elijah's Heritage Resort is deeply integrated into the local economic fabric of the surrounding county. When we resumed the massive construction, I strictly mandated that we exclusively hire local minority-owned contracting firms, plumbers, electricians, and landscapers. We intentionally sourced all of our building materials from local sustainable vendors. The massive, beautiful man-made lake is now completely filled with crystal-clear water, thanks to the legally secured subterranean aquifers I rightfully inherited. But the sparkling lake is not surrounded by an exclusive, restricted golf course. It is surrounded by beautiful public walking trails, a thriving local artisan market, and a massive community event center designed to host local weddings, family reunions, and high school graduations for the people who actually live in this county. We created over 500 permanent, well-paying jobs for the local community. The resort staff is not treated like disposable servants, which is exactly how Donovan used to treat working-class people. They receive comprehensive health care, full educational scholarships, and actual equity profit sharing in the massive resort. I used the immense liquid wealth of Blackwood Capital to establish a massive community grant program in my grandfather's name, providing crucial seed money to young, ambitious Black entrepreneurs who are desperately trying to build their own legitimate businesses without relying on predatory lenders. I took the incredibly dark, painful legacy of Donovan's massive fraud and completely alchemized it into a brilliant, shining beacon of generational wealth and true community empowerment. As I lean against the smooth, polished wooden railing of the high balcony, I take a slow, deep breath of the fresh, pine-scented air. I am wearing a simple, elegant green dress, my natural hair flowing freely down my back. I do not need to wear expensive, stiff power suits or heavy, aggressive makeup to prove my absolute worth anymore. My immense power does not come from the clothes I wear or the elite clubs I belong to. It comes directly from the deep, unbreakable roots my grandfather carefully planted for me decades ago. I look out over the glittering water of the massive lake, watching local families laughing and walking together in the warm sunshine. The deep, agonizing wounds my toxic family and my incredibly cruel ex-husband inflicted upon my spirit have finally completely healed. They did not leave ugly, jagged scars. They left thick, impenetrable armor. I pick up a framed photograph resting on the small patio table next to me. It is the very same antique oil painting of Grandpa Elijah and me fishing quietly on the serene mountain lake. I had paid a master artisan thousands of dollars to meticulously repair the broken canvas and craft a beautiful new frame. I trace my finger gently over the painted image of my grandfather's smiling face. He was the only person in my entire life who truly recognized my immense potential before I even had the absolute courage to see it in myself. He knew that if he simply handed me a massive fortune, I would likely let Donovan slowly, quietly steal it from me to keep the false peace in our toxic marriage. He knew I needed to lose absolutely everything in order to finally discover exactly how incredibly strong I truly was. He forced me to walk through the devastating blazing fire so I could legally rightfully claim the heavy iron crown he had secretly forged for me. I set the beautiful framed painting back down on the table and looked directly forward into the camera, my vision perfectly clear and my spirit entirely unbroken. Donovan took my house, my car, and my savings. He thought I was just a girl with 2 suitcases. But he forgot the most important lesson in our culture. Never underestimate the roots of the trees you try to cut down. Thank you, Grandpa. I played the hand you dealt me, and we took the whole house. Fade to black. The greatest lesson here is that true strength moves in absolute silence. People driven by greed and arrogance will eventually build their own traps. Donovan and his toxic family mistook Charmaine's quiet resilience for weakness, never realizing that real power doesn't need to scream to be heard. When others try to strip away your dignity, remember your value is never defined by their cruel treatment. Stay composed, honor your deep roots, and let their blind arrogance become their ultimate downfall. If you have ever overcome toxic people who underestimated you, please subscribe and share your story below.